Get comfortable, pull your blanket up a little higher if you need to, maybe turn the lights all the way down, or just let whatever soft glow you are sitting in be enough for now. Because for the next little while, we are going to talk about The Simpsons. Not the episodes you can recite from memory, not the fan theories you have already read 100 times. We are going somewhere quieter than that tonight, into the margins and the archives and the footnotes, into the production notes, and the recording booth stories, and the writer's room arguments that nobody documented but the people who were there. Into the facts that even devoted fans have never heard, the stories that lived briefly in specific rooms and then quietly dissolved into the long history of the longest-running animated series in American television. 177 of them. All of them true. All of them worth knowing. So settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let the day go. We are heading to Springfield. Number Section 1. Origins, Creation, and the Early Days. Fact 1. The Simpsons did not begin as a television show. Before it was a cultural institution, before it held records that no other series in television history has come close to matching, before Homer's voice was an Oxford English Dictionary entry and a theme park attraction and the subject of university lectures, it was a 30-second animated bumper. A brief interstitial segment that aired between sketches on The Tracy Ullman Show beginning in April of 1987. These early shorts were crude by almost any standard, barely recognizable as the family we came to know across the following decades. The characters moved with a hesitant, slightly lurching quality. The color palette was muddier than what the show would develop. Homer's hair configuration was different. The backgrounds were simpler. The voices were present but not yet fully settled into what they would become. But something alive existed in those shorts even so. Something that Fox network executives recognized when they were scanning their nascent network's lineup for properties with genuine potential. Fox had launched only a year earlier and was desperate for programming that could distinguish itself from the three established networks that had dominated American television for decades. An animated primetime comedy aimed at adults was a genuine risk in 1987. Nothing like it had succeeded in American primetime since the Flintstones had closed out its run in the mid-1960s. And yet the Tracy Ullman shorts kept drawing attention. The audiences kept responding. And eventually the conversation about a full series began in earnest. Fact 2. Matt Groening drew the original character sketches for The Simpsons while sitting in the lobby outside James L. Brooks's office, waiting for a meeting that was about to change his life in ways he did not anticipate. He had not come to pitch The Simpsons. He had come to pitch an animated adaptation of his existing comic strip, Life in Hell, which had been running in alternative newspapers since 1977 and had developed a devoted underground following. But sitting in that lobby with the meeting only minutes away, Groening was struck by a sudden and very particular fear. If he licensed Life in Hell to a television production, he would lose control of it. The characters and the voice and the specific sensibility he had spent a decade developing would belong, contractually, to someone else entirely. And if the show failed or if it was produced in a way he hated, there would be nothing he could do about it. So he pivoted. He invented a new family on the spot, sketched them quickly on a piece of paper right there in the lobby, gave them names borrowed from members of his own family, and walked into the meeting with something that had not existed 30 minutes earlier. The Simpsons were born in a waiting room, out of anxiety and improvisation, in roughly the time it takes to finish a cup of coffee. Groening has told this story many times in many interviews over the years, with a consistency that suggests it has not been significantly embellished in the retelling. The family that would eventually be watched by hundreds of millions of people across more than 90 countries began as a hurried sketch on a piece of paper in a hallway. Fact 3. The names in the Simpson family come directly from Groening's own life. His father was named Homer. His mother was named Margaret, called Marge by the people close to her. He had sisters named Lisa and Maggie. Bart was the only name invented specifically for the show, constructed as an anagram of the word brat, which fits the character's essential identity perfectly, though Groening has also said in different interviews that he simply liked the percussive sound of it when spoken aloud. Both explanations can be true simultaneously and probably are. He chose deliberately not to name any character after himself. There is no Matt in the family. Groening has said in interviews that when pressed on which character he most identifies with, the honest answer is probably Lisa. The child who sees everything with uncomfortable clarity and cannot make herself see less, who is too intelligent for her circumstances and must live in them anyway. There is something autobiographical in that description that goes beyond the surface fact of the shared initial. Fact 4. The Simpsons almost premiered on a completely different network. Before Fox committed to developing the full series, HBO expressed genuine and substantive interest in the property. Executives at the premium cable network had seen the Tracy Ullman shorts and believed, correctly, that a full show was buried inside them. A pitch meeting actually happened. The conversation was real and advanced enough that the eventual choice of Fox over HBO was a genuine decision rather than a foregone conclusion. Several factors informed the choice. Fox's lower ratings threshold for success meant the show would have more room to develop its voice without being canceled before it had the chance to become itself. HBO's audience in 1989 was significantly smaller than a broadcast network's, and Groening wanted the show to reach the widest possible audience. The alternate history of The Simpsons on HBO is one of the more interesting counterfactuals in television. It might have been edgier. It might have been canceled after 2 seasons. It might have been something the show's eventual audience would not recognize. We will never know. Fact 5. The episode that aired as the series premiere was not originally intended to be the premiere at all. Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, which broadcast on December 17, 1989, was produced as a Christmas special. It was not designed to introduce the series to a new audience in the way a traditional pilot episode would be. The actual intended first episode was Some Enchanted Evening, a story about Homer and Marge hiring a babysitter while they went out for the evening. The reason for the swap was practical and somewhat embarrassing for the production. When Some Enchanted Evening came back from the animation studio in South Korea, the quality was so far below what had been specified in the production materials that the episode was essentially unusable. Characters were off-model, colors were wrong throughout. The timing of the animation against the recorded dialogue was inconsistent from scene to scene. The production team made the decision to send the episode back for complete rework, a process that would take weeks. The Christmas episode, further along in post-production, was moved to the premiere slot. It was the right accident to have. The very first thing audiences saw was a family struggling financially during the holidays, a father working overtime dressed as a department store Santa, a last-minute dog won at a racetrack after a horse failed to win the money needed for Christmas presents. It was warm and funny and genuinely touching in equal measure, and it set an emotional standard that the show would spend decades trying to live up to. Fact 6. Bart Simpson was nearly voiced by a man, or, more specifically, by an actual young boy. The original production assumption was that the character would be cast the way child characters in American animation were typically cast, with a real child performer providing the voice. Several young boys auditioned. None of them felt right. The voices were too thin or too self-conscious, or too obviously a child performing what they thought a mischievous boy should sound like, rather than simply being one. The process was becoming frustrating. Then Nancy Cartwright came in. She had been invited to read for Lisa, who at that point in the show's development was actually the wilder and more rebellious of the 2 siblings. Cartwright found the Lisa material uninteresting in the audition context and asked if she could try Bart instead. The producers said yes. She did the voice for the first time right there in the audition room, and within minutes the decision was effectively made. She has now voiced Bart Simpson for longer than most of the show's current viewers have been alive. Fact 7. Julie Kavner, who voices Marge, was specifically chosen because of the distinctive and unusual quality of her voice. Groening has described it in various interviews as something that sounds simultaneously warm and slightly strained, like someone who has been patient for a very long time and is managing that patience with considerable skill. The voice has a distinctive rasp to it that suggests experience and wear, a life that has not been frictionless. It is not a conventional mother voice in the sense that American animation had established by 1989. It is stranger and more individual than that. Kavner herself has spoken about the physical demands of the voice, which sits at a specific register that requires conscious effort to maintain. She has been careful throughout the show's run to protect her vocal cords, turning down live performance and speaking engagement opportunities that might have put the specific quality of the voice at risk. The Marge voice is not effortless for her. It is a performance that requires her to inhabit a specific physical state, and she has treated the maintenance of that state with the seriousness of a professional musician protecting an irreplaceable instrument. Fact 8. The first season of The Simpsons was produced under significant budget pressure and the visual quality of the animation varied considerably from episode to episode depending on which production team handled it and how much revision time was available before the air date. Some scenes from first season episodes were so visually rough that they were quietly reanimated years later for syndication reruns, without announcement or formal acknowledgement, simply to bring the visual standard closer to what later seasons had established as normal. Homer's 5 o'clock shadow, that perpetual blue-gray stubble that became one of his most immediately recognizable visual features, was not initially a deliberate character design choice. It was an animation shorthand, a quick visual marker that animators used to indicate maleness without adding facial features that would slow down the drawing process. It stayed on the character because test audiences responded to it. There was something in the stubble that communicated the essential Homerness of Homer, the sense of a man who is always slightly behind on the maintenance of himself, who tries to present respectably and never quite gets ahead of the accumulating entropy of his own circumstances. The accident became the character. Fact 9. James L. Brooks, who has executive produced the show from its first episode to its current run, brought to The Simpsons a set of expectations that were genuinely unusual for an animated series in 1989. Brooks had spent his career in prestige live-action television. He had worked on The Mary Tyler Moore Show and Rhoda in the 1970s. He had produced and directed Terms of Endearment, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture in 1983. He was not a person who thought of animation as a lesser creative form or as a medium that required a diminished creative standard. He insisted from the earliest development meetings that the show needed to make people cry as well as laugh. He wanted emotional authenticity inside the cartoon frame. He pushed back against the assumption widespread in American broadcasting at the time that animation was for children and that complexity of feeling was therefore not part of the contract. He wanted stories that took the characters seriously as people and respected the audience's capacity for genuine emotional engagement. This insistence is why the show's earliest episodes feel different from every other animated series that was on American television at the same time. Fact 10. The show's distinctive yellow skin color was a deliberate creative decision made by the colorist Gheorghe Pelus, working with the production team on the original character designs. The reasoning was practical before it was aesthetic. Television sets in 1989 were not particularly color accurate by modern standards. Colors that looked vivid in a production studio could appear muted or washed out on a typical home television set of that era. Yellow, specifically the particular warm yellow Pelus developed for the Simpson family, was a color that maintained its vibrancy across a wide range of television display conditions. It was bright and immediately readable and completely distinctive. Groening approved the choice without hesitation. The yellow skin became so synonymous with the show that it functions now as a kind of trademark, a visual signal that communicates Simpsons' character before any other visual information has been consciously processed. When the show wants to signal that a visitor has arrived in Springfield from the normal world outside, one of the most effective techniques available is to draw that visitor with more naturalistic skin tones. The yellow became a marker of belonging to the cartoon world of Springfield. It was a design choice that accumulated meaning over decades of use. Fact 11. The Simpsons was not an immediate and unambiguous ratings phenomenon. The premiere episode drew strong numbers, partly because Fox promoted it heavily, and partly because the Christmas scheduling gave it a natural cultural moment to land in. But in the weeks that followed, the ratings were less consistent, and the show was in the process of finding its audience while its audience was still figuring out what exactly it was watching. Critics in the early months were not universally kind. Several prominent television reviewers dismissed the show as vulgar and disposable entertainment with a poor influence on American children. The concern about Bart Simpson specifically generated coverage that went well beyond the entertainment pages. Schools across the United States banned Bart Simpson merchandise. Principals made announcements over public address systems warning students that Bart's attitude and behavior were not acceptable models for them to emulate. The controversy was, as controversies always are for popular culture properties, extraordinarily good for the show's cultural profile. Fact 12. President George H.W. Bush made The Simpsons a genuine political talking point in a speech delivered at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention in January of 1992. The speech was about American values and family, and it included the prepared line that he wanted American families to be more like the Waltons and less like The Simpsons. The show's producers responded with remarkable speed. Within days, they had written and animated a brief sequence in which the Simpson family watches Bush's speech on their television, and Homer says, with complete sincerity, that the Simpsons are not so different from the Waltons. Both families are just praying for an end to the Depression. The line worked precisely because it was accurate. The Waltons, set during the Great Depression, were indeed a family defined by economic hardship and collective survival. The comparison worked against the rhetorical point it was meant to make. The sequence aired, it landed extremely well, and the exchange between a sitting American president and an animated cartoon family became one of the most celebrated early cultural moments in the show's history. Fact 13. The couch gag, the brief visual joke at the end of the opening title sequence in which the family rushes to the living room couch and something unexpected happens, was invented as a practical solution to a runtime problem, rather than as a deliberate and intentional comedic device. Early episodes were coming in at inconsistent lengths. Some ran slightly over the broadcast window and needed trimming. Some ran slightly under and needed additional material. The standard approaches to managing this, cutting a joke from the body of an episode or adding dialogue, both had costs that the production found unacceptable. Cuts reduced joke density. Additions risked diluting the established pacing. The couch gag was the elegant solution. A brief, self-contained visual sequence at the end of the title sequence that could be made longer or shorter depending on the episode's need, without affecting the story itself. Over the subsequent decades, it became one of the show's most celebrated recurring elements. Guest directors have produced couch gags that run for several minutes and function as complete short films. Banksy directed one in 2010 that became a news story. Guillermo del Toro directed one containing references to dozens of horror films. The functional device became an art form. Fact 14. The town name Springfield was chosen by Groening specifically because of its ubiquity in American geography. There are Springfields in at least 34 of the 50 American states. When Groening selected the name, he was choosing a word that would resist geographic specificity, a name that could belong anywhere and therefore in a sense belonged everywhere simultaneously. He has confirmed this reasoning in multiple interviews, most notably in a piece published in Smithsonian Magazine in 2012, in which he also mentioned that Springfield, Oregon, which sits near his hometown of Portland, was a specific personal touchstone. But he was careful to distinguish the animated Springfield from any real place. The fictional town was never meant to be a direct depiction of a specific location. It was meant to feel like the town underneath all American towns, the common infrastructure of American domestic life, the kind of community that exists in every region of the country and produces, reliably, the same combination of aspirations and compromises and small personal catastrophes. Fact 15. The opening title sequence, with its famous tracking shot over the town of Springfield accompanied by Danny Elfman's theme music, was designed with a specific purpose that goes beyond visual introduction. Groening has said in interviews that he wanted viewers to feel, by the time the opening sequence had finished and the episode proper began, that they had genuinely arrived somewhere specific. That they knew where they were in a way that would orient every story told there. The sequence establishes, in roughly 60 seconds of screen time, the nuclear power plant where Homer works, the elementary school where Bart and Lisa spend their days, the Quick E-Mart where the family shops, the church where Reverend Lovejoy preaches, the town square where civic life nominally occurs. It maps the emotional geography of Springfield before any single episode requires that geography to be legible. Every revision of the opening sequence across the show's history has maintained this orienting function, even as the specific visual details have changed and updated. Fact 16. Homer's famous exclamation of frustration, that elongated sound that has become one of the most recognized audio signatures in the history of American entertainment, was not scripted as a specific piece of dialogue in the early episodes. Dan Castellaneta developed it organically during the recording of the show's first season, reaching for a sound that would communicate Homer's particular relationship to failure and frustration. Not the sharp, explosive frustration of a man surprised by a setback, but the slower, more experienced frustration of a man who recognizes, while it is happening, that this is exactly the kind of thing that always happens to him. The first versions Castellaneta produced were longer and more theatrical than what became iconic. The recording team kept asking him to compress it, to find the essential core of the sound without the elaboration surrounding it. He trimmed it through repeated takes across multiple recording sessions until it reached the version the show settled on. That version has since been trademarked. It has been sampled in music, incorporated into advertising campaigns around the world, and recognized by people who have never watched a complete episode of the show. It is by most measures the most universally recognized single sound in the history of television. Fact 17. The show was animated in its earliest years by a studio in South Korea called ACOM. This arrangement was standard practice for American television animation at the time. The labor-intensive process of producing thousands of individual animation frames per episode was dramatically less expensive at Korean studios than it would have been at American facilities, and virtually every American animated series produced in the 1980s used some form of overseas animation production. The relationship with ACOM had its persistent difficulties. Quality control was a genuine challenge. Communication across time zones and language differences was imperfect, in ways that occasionally produced significant problems. The story of Some Enchanted Evening returning from Korea in essentially unusable condition was the most dramatic instance of the problem, but it was not the only one. Over the course of the show's early run, the production developed increasingly detailed storyboards and increasingly rigorous quality review processes to manage the inherent challenges of producing a visually consistent show across thousands of miles of physical distance. Fact 18. The voice recordings for The Simpsons are done in a way that is significantly different from most animated television productions. The main cast records their lines together in the same room at the same time. This is genuinely unusual in the industry. The standard practice in animated television is to record voice actors individually and in isolation, then assemble the ensemble quality of the performance in the editing process. The logistical simplicity of scheduling one actor at a time, rather than coordinating an entire cast, makes isolation recording the default. The Simpsons production team discovered early on that the chemistry between the actors when they were physically in the same space produced something that could not be replicated by assembling isolated performances after the fact. When Castellaneta and Kavner are in the same room reacting to each other in real time, the performances have a quality that neither produces alone. The timing is different. The emotional responsiveness is different. The accumulation of decades of working together in the same physical space has produced a collective instrument, a specific sound that exists between the performers rather than within any single one of them. Fact 19. The show's famous theme music was composed by Danny Elfman in less than 2 days. Groening came to Elfman with a description rather than a reference. Something that felt like an electric, energized version of a 1950s or 60s American family sitcom theme, but with an edge that acknowledged the satire underneath the surface warmth. He wanted the music to feel familiar and slightly wrong simultaneously. Elfman, primarily known at that point for his work with the band Oingo Boingo and for his score on Tim Burton's Pee-wee's Big Adventure, absorbed the description and essentially wrote the theme in his head before sitting down to notate it formally. He has said in interviews that the melody arrived essentially complete, which he described as an unusual experience even for someone who writes music professionally. The theme has since been performed at Carnegie Hall, recorded by major orchestras, reimagined across dozens of musical genres, and recognized as music by people who could not name the show it came from. It was written in 48 hours. Fact 20. The Simpsons movie, released in July of 2007 after 18 years of the television series, had been in various stages of development for a significant portion of those 18 years. Groening has described the making of the film as one of the most difficult experiences of his professional life, partly because the writing team kept generating material that was strong enough for the film, but then using it in television episodes instead, which meant the film script had to be restarted repeatedly. The film went through approximately 100 drafts across years of development. Some jokes in the final version of the film were written, revised, discarded, reconsidered, rewritten, and finalized through so many iterations that the writers could no longer remember which version of a given line had come first, or who had originated it. The film ultimately grossed over $530 million worldwide. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let us know where you are watching from and what time it is there. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is a good moment. There are 157 more facts ahead of us, and they only get more interesting. Number, Section 2. The Writer's Room, Harvard Nerds, and Hidden Genius. Fact 21. The Simpsons writing room has, across its history, maintained a higher concentration of Ivy League academic credentials than any other television production on record. The show's specific relationship with Harvard University is well documented enough to have become almost a cliché in discussions of the show, but the reality behind the shorthand is stranger and more interesting than the summary suggests. The Harvard Lampoon, the university's student humor magazine, has produced a remarkable number of people who went on to work on The Simpsons. Al Jean, Mike Reiss, Conan O'Brien, Greg Daniels, and many others all passed through the Lampoon before arriving in The Simpsons writers' room. The Harvard connection was self-reinforcing. Jean and Reiss, as early showrunners, hired from their network. Writers hired from their network brought other writers they knew. The culture of the Lampoon, which emphasizes a specific kind of dense, self-aware, reference-heavy humor that rewards intelligence without becoming inaccessible, translated remarkably well into the early Simpsons voice. The underlying intelligence of the writing, the density of ideas packed into 22 minutes of comedy, bore the fingerprints of people who had spent their formative years in an environment that treated comedy as a serious intellectual pursuit. Fact 22. John Swartzwelder wrote 59 episodes of The Simpsons, a number that represents roughly 8% of the show's total output. Through the seasons he worked on it, and that stands as the single largest individual writing contribution in the show's entire history. He is not a famous name outside of devoted fan circles. He has given almost no public interviews. He has no social media presence. He largely vanished from public professional life after leaving the show following season 13, with the exception of a series of self-published comic novels he began releasing in recent years. The novels are written in a voice that fans of his Simpsons episodes recognized immediately. Swartzwelder's specific contribution to the show was a kind of accelerating absurdism with an economic undertow. His episodes are frequently about systems failing, about institutions being revealed as incompetent or corrupt, about the ordinary American man encountering a world specifically designed to confuse and defeat him. The comedy is broad at the surface and very dark underneath, and the darkness is never stated directly. It accumulates through the internal logic of the jokes rather than through any explicit thematic declaration. He was reportedly an unusual presence in the writing room. He had a diner booth installed in his home when California passed an indoor smoking ban so that he could continue writing in the exact physical environment he had always worked in. He wrote 59 television episodes in it. Fact 23. The production pipeline for a single episode of The Simpsons in its classic era was approximately 6 months from initial pitch to broadcast. The process was elaborate and sequential. A story began as a pitch in the writer's room, a brief verbal description of a premise. If the room responded well, it moved to an outline. The outline expanded into a table draft, the first full script version of the episode. The table draft was read aloud with the full writing staff present. Jokes were evaluated in real time based on whether they landed, and the script returned to the room for revision. After revision, the script went to a cast reading, then more revisions, then recording, then animation, then post-production and final editing. By the time an episode aired, the writing staff had moved so far forward in the pipeline on subsequent episodes that writers sometimes struggled to recall the specifics of something they had worked on 6 months earlier. The show was running 5 or 6 episodes simultaneously at different production stages at any given moment. The people making it were always living in multiple different story worlds at once. Fact 24. The core writing group that defined the show's sensibility in the period most fans consider its creative peak, roughly seasons 3 through 8, developed a culture of self-criticism that was unusually rigorous even by the standards of professional comedy. They had a collectively high threshold for what counted as a genuinely good joke. A joke that worked in the conventional television comedy sense, that would have landed well in virtually any other comedy being produced in the same period, was not necessarily sufficient for The Simpsons room. The standard was the joke that surprised even the people who had been writing professionally for years. The joke that could not be seen coming, even when you knew the context perfectly. This culture of relentless self-elevation is the most convincing single explanation for why the show's best episodes feel different from everything else that was being produced simultaneously, and it is also the clearest explanation for why maintaining that standard across decades of continuous production proved so genuinely difficult. Fact 25. George Meyer, who served as a writer and producer on the show from its earliest seasons through the late 2000s, has been described by multiple colleagues as the single funniest person they ever encountered in a professional context. This is a notable claim in a room that at various points contained Conan O'Brien. Meyer's specific gift was for a variety of humor that combined genuine philosophical seriousness with absolute absurdism, a way of following the internal logic of a premise to its most extreme possible conclusion, and then finding the comedy in having arrived somewhere no reasonable person could have anticipated. He was deeply invested in the show's function as social criticism, in comedy as one of the primary available tools for speaking truth about power to an audience large enough to matter. A profile of Meyer, published in The New Yorker in 2000, described him as the secret engine of the show. Multiple writers who worked alongside him have said that his presence and standards raised the level of everyone around him in ways that were almost impossible to quantify, but were immediately visible in the work. Fact 26. The writing room had an informal but consistently applied method for evaluating whether a joke was working. There were no formal voting mechanisms, no structured critique sessions, no written rubric for comedic quality. The evaluation was more immediate than any of that. If something was funny, the room laughed. If it was not, the room was silent. In a room full of people trained to find at least something amusing in almost anything, a silence was a very specific and unambiguous kind of information. Former writers have described the experience of pitching something that died in that room as one of the more clarifying professional experiences available. You knew immediately and completely where you stood. There was no ambiguity, no polite murmur that could be interpreted as mild approval, no room to convince yourself the joke had half worked. The room either responded or it did not. The jokes that passed through that silence and made it into finished episodes were jokes tested against one of the sharpest comedic sensibilities ever assembled in a single professional workplace. Fact 27. Conan O'Brien's 2 seasons on the show, before he departed to host Late Night on NBC in 1993, produced several episodes that are routinely cited by fans and critics as being among the greatest in the show's entire history. Marge vs. The Monorail, which aired in Season 4, is the most celebrated. The episode follows Springfield being swindled into purchasing a defective monorail by a con man named Lyle Landley, and it is structured as a musical parody with original songs written in the style of classic Rodgers and Hammerstein theatrical production. It is one of the broadest and most formally ambitious things the show had attempted to that point in its run. The pitch was met with significant skepticism in the room. The premise seemed too large, too reliant on the musical parody frame, too far from the grounded domestic comedy the show's best earlier episodes were built on. O'Brien pushed for it. The episode was produced, the songs were written and recorded, and the result was not simply a success but a kind of template. It proved the show could go bigger and stranger and more formally experimental than it had been, and that the experimental episodes could be among the best rather than the most indulgent. When O'Brien left for late-night television, the loss to the writing room was real and acknowledged by those who remained. Fact 28. The show has a specific approach to technical accuracy that distinguishes it from most television comedy. When a storyline involves a specialized field of knowledge, whether that field is law, medicine, physics, economics, or anything else with its own internal logic, the production typically brings in an expert consultant. These consultants are not hired to write jokes. They are hired to ensure that the jokes the writers produce are built on accurate foundations, that the satire is aimed at things that are actually true about a given subject rather than at popular misconceptions about it. The result is visible in specific episodes that have been studied and appreciated by professionals in the fields depicted. The equation that appears in the Season 7 episode Homer Cubed, which mathematicians have analyzed and found to be a remarkably specific anticipation of a calculation related to the Higgs boson particle, was not a coincidence or a happy accident. David Cohen, the writer who included it, holds a doctorate in physics from Harvard University. He knew exactly what he was writing. The joke was as precise as the writer's expertise allowed it to be. Fact 29. The table read, in which a new script is performed aloud by the full cast for the first time while the writing staff observes, is one of the most significant moments in the show's production process. The table read functions as a real-time evaluation of the material, a test of the script against the specific instruments that will eventually perform it. Writers attend these sessions and take notes throughout. The reactions of the cast to specific lines, the places where a performance elevates material that seemed merely adequate on the page, and the places where material that read well proves flat in actual performance, all of this informs the subsequent rounds of revision that follow. Dan Castellaneta is particularly noted among his colleagues for his ability to find in the moment of performance, vocal choices that transform the quality of a line. He will sometimes deliver a line in a way that nobody in the room anticipated, finding an emotional reading or a comic accent that makes the joke work differently from how it was written. These moments are observed by the writers and sometimes followed rather than corrected. Fact 30. The Simpsons writing room has produced an unusual number of people who went on to build significant careers outside the show. Greg Daniels, who wrote some of the show's most celebrated mid-period episodes, went on to develop the American version of The Office and Parks and Recreation, both of which became defining comedies of their era. Conan O'Brien's late-night career lasted more than 3 decades. Dana Gould, Ken Keeler, Bill Oakley, Josh Weinstein, and numerous other Simpsons alumni have had substantial careers in film and television. The room functioned, for many of its alumni, as a graduate school in the craft of comedy writing. The specific combination of intellectual rigor, creative ambition, and extremely high standards of self-criticism that defined the room in its best years produced writers who knew, at a level most television writers never reach, exactly what they were doing and precisely why. Several have described their time on the show as the formative professional experience of their lives, the years during which they developed the skills and the standards that everything they produced afterward was built upon. Fact 31. There is a specific category of Simpsons joke that exists entirely in the visual register, that has no verbal component, and that is designed specifically for viewers who pay close enough attention to catch it in the moment or patient enough to find it frame by frame. These jokes appear in backgrounds, on signs, in newspaper headlines visible for a fraction of a second, in the fine print of documents characters briefly hold up. The writers refer to them informally as freeze-frame jokes, because the rise of home video and later streaming meant that viewers could pause episodes and study frames that had previously been visible for only an instant. The existence of freeze-frame jokes represents a specific philosophy of comedy. It is a commitment to populating the world of the show with humor that exceeds what any single viewing can capture, a generosity toward the most attentive fraction of the audience that operates invisibly below the main comedy track. The show rewards people who look closely. It does not demand that they look closely. But if you do pause at the right moment, the show gives you something extra. A private joke between the production and its most devoted viewers. Fact 32. The show's official position on continuity has been stated clearly by multiple writers and producers across different periods of the show's history. Continuity exists within individual episodes and within small clusters of directly related episodes. It does not bind the show across its entire multi-decade run. This is partly practical. A show that has produced nearly 800 episodes cannot maintain strict internal consistency without eventually becoming paralyzed by its own accumulated history. It is also philosophical. The writers have consistently believed that the best version of a story takes precedence over strict adherence to what a previous episode happened to establish. What is interesting is the degree to which the show has occasionally leaned into its own inconsistency as a source of comedy, making jokes about Homer's backstory changing from story to story, having characters note that their memories seem unreliable, turning the absence of consistent continuity into a joke rather than a flaw to be concealed. The self-awareness with which the show has handled this is part of what distinguishes it from shows that simply ignore their own contradictions and hope the audience does not notice. Fact 33. The Homer Cubed segment from the Season 7 Halloween special was one of the most technically ambitious things American television animation had attempted when it aired in October of 1995. The segment placed Homer in a fully three-dimensional computer-animated environment, a strange geometric space of floating forms and impossible architecture, and required the production to work with an external CGI studio, whose work on this project contributed to their later work on the first Shrek film. The team was making decisions about lighting, texture, camera movement, and spatial composition without an established playbook to consult. The techniques that would later make computer animation routine in Hollywood had not yet been standardized. The result, viewed now, shows its age in specific ways. But the ambition of the choice, the willingness to completely transform the show's visual language for a single segment in the service of a specific effect, remains remarkable. Fact 34. David Cohen, who wrote for the show in the mid-90s before departing to create Futurama, embedded a series of genuine mathematical references throughout his episodes that operate simultaneously on multiple levels. The surface-level viewer processes them as character details or background jokes. The viewer, with a mathematics background, processes them as precise and accurate references to real mathematical concepts and specific theorems. Simon Singh, a British author and science communicator, wrote an entire book published in 2013, documenting the degree to which the show's mathematically trained writers embedded real mathematical content into the comedy. Singh has given lectures at universities using Simpsons episodes as primary texts. The material holds up under that level of scrutiny. The show contains, if you know how to read it, a genuine and substantive engagement with mathematical ideas that goes well beyond what any casual television comedy needed to include. Fact 35. The Room's attitude towards sentimentality is one of its most distinctive and most carefully maintained characteristics. The Simpsons writing staff has always been deeply suspicious of emotion that arrives too easily or feels insufficiently earned. When a story moves toward a moment that risks being tender in a way that feels unearned, the Room pushes back. The instinct is not to avoid emotion, which the show has produced in genuine abundance across its run, but to ensure that the emotion has been paid for by the story. You cannot have the moment of genuine feeling without having done the work that earns it. The result is that the show's most emotional moments, the ones that have made viewers cry in the middle of what they expected to be a comedy, hit with a force that more routinely sentimental shows cannot match. The emotion is rationed and protected, given to the audience only when fully earned, which means that when it arrives, it feels entirely real. Fact 36. The show's portrayal of religion has been one of its most persistently interesting areas of subject matter. The Simpsons has depicted religion with a complexity genuinely unusual for mainstream American network comedy. God appears as a character on multiple occasions, and is treated neither as a figure of mockery nor as an unambiguous moral authority. The Springfield Church is depicted as a real community institution with genuine value and also as a source of comfortable hypocrisy and social conformity. Ned Flanders' faith is presented as sincere enough to be real and fragile enough to be human. The writing room has included people with a range of personal relationships to religion, and the tension between those perspectives has arguably produced a more honest portrayal of American religious life than most dramatic programs manage. The show does not have a position on whether God exists. It has a very detailed position on how people relate to the idea that God might exist, and that position is more nuanced than any summary of it would suggest. Fact 37. The specific voice the show found for its satire of American media was established early and has remained remarkably consistent. Kent Brockman, the Springfield television news anchor voiced by Harry Shearer, embodies a set of observations about broadcast journalism that were accurate in the early 1990s and have only become more accurate with the passage of time. Brockman's willingness to report uncritically on anything presented to him, his specific combination of performative seriousness and total incuriosity, his readiness to take catastrophically wrong positions based on minimal information, and then reverse those positions with equal ease, these were comedic exaggerations of tendencies already visible in American television news when the show began. The degree to which subsequent events in American media have made Brockman look less like an exaggeration and more like a realistic portrait is something the show's writers have acknowledged in interviews with a mixture of comedy and resignation. Fact 38. Several of the show's episodes from its peak period were built around premises that the writing room initially considered too strange or too formally experimental to work within the show's established conventions. The room's willingness to attempt the formally unusual and to trust the audience to follow them somewhere unexpected is part of what gave the middle seasons their specific energy. Episodes that seemed too conceptually strange in the pitch sometimes turned out to be the ones that worked best, precisely because they required the writing to do something harder and more interesting than a conventional premise would have demanded. Fact 39. The show's relationship with its own critical reception has been unusual from the beginning. Early criticism was hostile on moral grounds. Mid-period criticism was enthusiastic and celebratory. Later criticism shifted toward elegiac, mourning a perceived decline from earlier standards. Throughout all three phases, the people making the show were aware of and engaged with the critical discourse in ways that occasionally fed back into the work itself. The show has made jokes about its own reputation, about the argument over when it peaked, about the specific expectations that long-term fans bring to new episodes. This self-awareness of its own critical history is one of the stranger and more interesting aspects of a show that has been running long enough to have developed a relationship with its own legacy while still actively producing new work. Fact 40. Al Jean, who has been the show's showrunner since season 13 and who worked on it in its earliest seasons before returning to the leadership role, holds the record as the longest-serving single showrunner in the show's history. His tenure has been characterized by what he has described as a commitment to institutional continuity, to maintaining what he understands as the show's essential qualities while adapting to the changed context in which it now operates. He has spent so much of his professional life thinking about The Simpsons, writing for it, leading it, that he has said in interviews that distinguishing his own creative identity from the show's has become genuinely difficult. He is both the steward of a voice he helped build and a person whose own voice has been shaped by decades of that stewardship. Section 3. The voices behind Springfield. Fact 41. Dan Castellaneta's workload as a voice actor on The Simpsons is one of the most demanding, sustained voice acting responsibilities in the history of the medium. He is, of course, the primary voice of Homer Simpson, the character he has inhabited for more than 3 decades and performed across hundreds of episodes. But Homer is far from the extent of his contribution to the show's vocal life. Castellaneta also voices Krusty the Clown, whose specific world-weary show business desperation is a completely different vocal instrument from Homer's. He voices groundskeeper Willie, whose Scottish working-class fury is one of the show's most reliable comedic textures. He voices Mayor Quimby, whose Kennedy-inflected patrician corruption is precise and specific. He voices Barney Gumble, whose alcoholic sentimentality is simultaneously funny and genuinely sad. He voices Hans Moleman, the tiny, eternally suffering background character. He voices Arnie Pye, the aggrieved helicopter traffic reporter. He voices Sideshow Bob's brother Cecil, and dozens of additional supporting characters across the show's entire run. The range of distinct voices he maintains simultaneously is extraordinary, and what makes it more extraordinary is that each voice requires a different physical production, a different relationship to the microphone, a different emotional register, a different internal character logic. Castellaneta can move between several of these within a single recording session. He has said in interviews that Homer is simultaneously the easiest and the most demanding of his characters. Easiest because after 3 decades, Homer arrives without conscious effort when needed. Most demanding because Homer requires genuine emotional availability, a willingness to be fully present and occasionally vulnerable, that the more broadly comic characters simply do not. Fact 42. Yeardley Smith, the voice of Lisa Simpson, has built one of the most specific and unusual voice acting careers in the history of American animation. Lisa is, in practical terms, her only significant animated role. She has not developed a secondary career voicing dozens of characters in different productions the way most of her colleagues have. This specificity appears to be a genuine choice. Smith has said in interviews that she takes Lisa's intelligence and emotional life seriously enough that she invests in the character with a depth that does not leave room for the kind of portfolio voice work, a more pragmatic approach to the career might encourage. She has also spoken about the particular strangeness of her professional situation. Being an adult woman with an adult woman's full life and perspective while simultaneously being on screen, an 8-year-old girl with an 8-year-old's circumstances. The relationship between Smith and Lisa has been described by people who know her as genuinely complex, not simply a performance relationship, but something more entangled with her own sense of identity. She has been Lisa for most of her adult life. Lisa has been 8 for all of that time. Fact 43. Harry Shearer's near departure from the show in 2015 was one of the most significant and publicly visible crises in the show's recent history. Shearer announced through social media that he would not return for season 27. The reasons involved contract terms and his desire for more professional flexibility to pursue other projects without The Simpsons production schedule constraining his availability. The announcement was unusually public for what are typically private contractual negotiations, and it created a period of genuine uncertainty about the show's future. Shearer voices a remarkable number of the show's characters, including Mr. Burns, Waylon Smithers, Principal Skinner, Ned Flanders, Kent Brockman, Dr. Julius Hibbert, Rainier Wolfcastle, and many others. The prospect of recasting all of those characters was daunting enough that the production reportedly considered it seriously before negotiations eventually resolved. The episode that aired during the period of uncertainty was written to minimize dialogue given to Shearer's characters without making their minimal presence a story element. And it stands in the catalog as a document of a moment when the show came close to losing one of its most essential contributors. Fact 44. Nancy Cartwright is one of the highest-paid voice actors in television history. The peak compensation figure for the main Simpsons cast, established during negotiations in the early 2000s, was $360,000 per episode for each of the 6 principal voice actors. This number, when it became public knowledge, had a significant impact on the voice acting industry broadly, shifting what the field considered possible compensation for performers in that category. The negotiation that produced the number was not easy or quick. There was a period during which the cast collectively threatened to walk away from the show unless the compensation more accurately reflected the show's extraordinary commercial value. The studio's eventual agreement was an acknowledgement that the show was simply not viable without its specific cast, and that the cost of that specificity was worth paying. Fact 45. Kelsey Grammer's performance as Sideshow Bob represents one of the most sustained single-character arcs in the history of television animation. Grammer first voiced Bob in a Season 1 episode in 1990. He has continued voicing the character through the current run of the show, meaning he has been performing the same animated character across more than 30 years and through multiple Emmy-winning seasons in completely separate television productions. His work as Frasier Crane on Cheers and Frasier ran concurrently with his Simpsons work for years. What Grammer brings to Sideshow Bob that makes the character irreplaceable is a specific kind of theatrical commitment. Bob's elaborate speeches, his grandiose self-justifications, his capacity for genuine menace beneath the comedy are all inseparable from Grammer's training as a classically oriented stage actor. He plays the character as though the comedy were tragedy, as though Bob's failures were genuinely catastrophic rather than merely cartoonish, and the gap between the gravity of the performance and the absurdity of the context is precisely where the humor lives. Another actor could voice Bob. It would be a fundamentally and irretrievably different character. Fact 46. The decision to remove Hank Azaria from the role of Apu Nahasapi Mapetilon in 2021, following years of criticism about the character and the voice, was one of the most significant decisions the show's production made in its recent history. The criticism, which grew substantially following the 2017 documentary The Problem with Apu, directed by Hari Kondabolu, focused on the harm caused by a broad comedic caricature of South Asian identity being the most visible representation of that identity on mainstream American television for more than 2 decades. Azaria, who had developed the voice from a combination of Peter Sellers' performance in The Party and his own encounters with Indian English accents, voiced the character for more than 25 years across hundreds of episodes. The recasting opened a broader industry conversation about voice casting in animation, about the responsibilities of shows with massive cultural reach, and about the distinction between performance and representation. Azaria has spoken about the process of grappling with this criticism in extensive interviews conducted in the years following his departure from the role. Fact 47. Phil Hartman voiced 2 of the most beloved recurring characters in the show's history, Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz, and his specific gift as a performer was so central to both of them that the production retired the characters entirely rather than recast them. Following his death in May of 1998, Hartman was 49 years old. His characters simply did not appear in subsequent episodes. No explanation was offered within the show's fiction. No in-universe departure or death was depicted. The characters had existed, and then they did not. The absence was the memorial. Troy McClure, the washed-up actor whose film credits were invariably suspicious, worked because Hartman performed him with absolute sincerity. There was no winking. There was no acknowledgement that the character was ridiculous. Hartman inhabited McClure's complete self-belief and let the comedy arise from the gap between what the character believed about himself and what the audience could plainly see. Lionel Hutz, the incompetent personal injury lawyer, worked by the same mechanism. Total commitment to the character's worldview was the engine of every joke, and that total commitment belonged specifically to Hartman. Fact 48. The shift to remote recording during the COVID-19 pandemic beginning in March of 2020 was managed successfully in a technical sense. The episodes continued to be produced, the performances continued to be delivered, and the show remained on air without a break in broadcast. What the cast members have described in various interviews is how much was lost by the transition. The ensemble quality of the performances, the specific responsiveness that comes from being in the same physical space as your scene partners and being able to react to each other in real time, was not fully replicable through remote setup. The performances were individually excellent. The chemistry that arises between excellent performances happening simultaneously in the same room was, by the cast's own accounts, something that remote recording could not reproduce. They were still giving you Homer and Marge. They were not giving you Homer and Marge inhabiting the same air. Fact 49. Tress MacNeille, who has provided voices for an extraordinary range of characters across the show's entire run, is one of the most versatile and least publicly recognized contributors to the show's audio world. She has voiced characters ranging from very young children to elderly women to authority figures to regional American archetypes of various kinds. Her contribution to the show's texture is substantial and almost entirely invisible to casual viewers, which is the nature of supporting character voice work done well. The best supporting performance is one in which you are only aware of the character, never of the performance. MacNeille's career has been defined by the sustained achievement of this goal, across hundreds of episodes across multiple decades. Fact 50. The recording sessions for the show have generated, over the decades, a body of outtake material that is both substantial in size and revealing in character. Some of this material has been released officially as bonus content on DVD releases. The released outtakes demonstrate the degree to which the performance of the episodes is a collaborative and generative process rather than a straightforward execution of scripted decisions. They reveal moments where a performer tries multiple readings of the same line in rapid succession, each one slightly different in its emotional coloring. They reveal moments where a performer improvises a line that is better than the scripted version and that improvisation is kept. They reveal the texture of the creative process in ways that the finished product inevitably conceals. The episodes are so complete and polished in their final form that it can be easy to assume every line was inevitable. The outtakes demonstrate that it was all choices, made in the moment, by specific people, with specific instincts, on specific days. Fact 51. Julie Kavner's voice has changed in perceptible ways across the show's 36-year run. The essential quality of the Marge voice, the combination of warmth and strain that makes it so immediately recognizable, has remained consistent. But the specific register has shifted slightly. The voice has deepened. The particular quality of breathiness in certain passages has become more pronounced. The effects of age on a voice are real and irreversible, and Kavner has managed her voice's evolution with the care of a musician managing the aging of their primary instrument. The production has accommodated this evolution in subtle ways, adjusting the material given to Marge and the vocal demands placed on the character to work with where Kavner's voice is now, rather than demanding she reproduce exactly what it sounded like in 1990. The result is that Marge sounds different in recent seasons from early ones, but not in a way that reads as degradation. She sounds like the same person has aged into that voice, which is exactly what has happened. Fact 52. Hank Azaria, in the extensive interviews he gave following his departure from the Apu role, spoke with unusual candor about the experience of inhabiting a character for 30 years. He described a phenomenon familiar to long-term voice actors. The way a character you voice consistently enough begins to colonize parts of your vocal life that you did not deliberately assign to it. He described catching himself slipping into a character voice in ordinary conversation without having made a conscious decision to do so. The characters, after enough repetitions over enough years, stop being separate tools that you pick up and put down. They become part of the larger instrument. He also spoke about the process of grappling with the criticism of the Apu character, about the realization that something he had done in good faith for a long time had caused genuine harm to real people. That conversation, and its public dimension, is now part of the permanent record of the show's history. Fact 53. The voice acting ensemble has maintained remarkable stability across the show's history. Most long-running television shows experience significant cast turnover across 3 decades. Actors leave for other opportunities, relationships with producers deteriorate, the logistics of maintaining a stable cast across decades become too complicated to manage. The main Simpsons voice cast has remained almost entirely consistent across the show's entire run, with departures driven almost exclusively by circumstances outside the production's control. This stability is partly financial. The compensation arrangements have made it genuinely advantageous for the performers to remain, but it is also relational. The cast members have described their working relationship with a consistency that suggests genuine affection and mutual respect built up across decades of shared work. They have been through major life events alongside each other. The stability of the cast is a function of the show's commercial success, and also of the specific human relationships that formed around the work. Fact 54. Dan Castellaneta and Julie Kavner, who voice Homer and Marge, are married to each other in real life and have been together since before the show began. Their real relationship has developed alongside and intertwined with the fictional relationship between the characters they perform across decades. They do not discuss publicly, in any particular detail, the degree to which their personal dynamic informs their professional performances. But several of their colleagues have observed that the specific texture of the Homer and Marge relationship, the combination of genuine love and comfortable exasperation, the sense of two people who know each other completely and have decided to keep choosing each other anyway, has a quality that professional skill alone does not fully account for. Fact 55. Pamela Hayden, who voices Milhouse Van Houten, developed the character's specific vocal quality through a process of emotional identification as much as technical vocal experimentation. Milhouse is a character defined by anxiety and yearning, by the specific experience of wanting badly to be included in a social world that consistently fails to fully include him. He is Bart's best friend, but the friendship is asymmetrical. He is devoted in ways that Bart does not entirely reciprocate. Hayden found a voice for this emotional landscape that is nasal and slightly wounded in a way that is both immediately funny and, if you listen closely, genuinely sad. Milhouse does not know that he sounds the way he sounds. Hayden knows, and she plays both registers simultaneously. Fact 56. Elizabeth Taylor agreed to voice Maggie's first spoken word in a Season 3 episode, and the production treated her willingness to record a single syllable with the seriousness the occasion warranted. Taylor recorded the word daddy with the same professionalism and seriousness she brought to any engagement. The result? That single syllable delivered by one of the most famous voices in the history of cinema became one of the most celebrated moments in the show's history. It was funny because of the contrast between the celebrity of the performer and the brevity of the performance. It was also genuinely moving because of what the word meant within the episode's story. Taylor managed both registers simultaneously in one word, which is exactly what great performers do. Fact 57. Kelsey Grammer has described his preparation for Sideshow Bob episodes as substantially more intensive than the preparation most voice actors undertake for animated work. The character's elaborate speeches and operatic declarations require a level of planning at the sentence level that improvisation or casual delivery cannot produce. Grammer studies the dialogue for Bob episodes with an attention to arc and rhythm that he has compared to his preparation for stage work. The final delivery sounds effortless. The effortlessness is the result of careful preparation, which is what effortlessness in performance almost always is. Fact 58. The guest voice process evolved significantly across the show's run in ways that reflect the show's shifting cultural status. In the early seasons, guest voices were relatively rare. The show was still establishing itself, and the appeal of a Simpsons appearance as a form of cultural status did not yet fully exist. Guest appearances in the first 2 or 3 seasons were chosen primarily on the basis of whether the person could serve the story. As the show became more prominent, the calculus shifted. By the mid-90s, the show had become one of the most culturally visible programs in American entertainment, and the appeal of a Simpsons appearance as a form of self-presentation was significant. Famous people sought appearances. The production found itself managing requests rather than simply making them. The challenge became distinguishing between guest appearances that genuinely served a story and guest appearances that served only the guest's desire to be associated with the show's cultural capital. Fact 59. Several voice actors on the show have spoken about the particular strangeness of voicing the same character through dramatically different periods of their own lives. The character does not age. The character does not change jobs or change cities or experience the accumulation of personal history. The character is frozen at the moment the show began and remains there through every season regardless of what has happened in the actor's actual life. Every piece of accumulated experience, every year's worth of development and change, goes into the recording booth with the performer and produces, on the other side, the same character who has been the same age for 36 years. The asymmetry is one of the genuinely strange aspects of living inside a very long-running animated production. Fact 60. The show has employed an unusually high number of performers who came from backgrounds in live performance, specifically stage and improvisational comedy, rather than from film or television. This background shows in specific ways in the ensemble performances. Stage-trained actors approach text with a different relationship to rhythm and intention. Improv-trained performers have a different relationship to in-the-moment flexibility and collaborative responsiveness. The Simpsons ensemble sounds like people who know how to listen to each other. That is a trained skill, and 3 decades of working together has deepened it to a point where the collective instrument the cast has built is unlike anything else in voice acting. Section 4. Animation Secrets and Visual Easter Eggs. Fact 61. The visual layer of The Simpsons contains a density of jokes and references that no single viewing can fully exhaust. Background details in the show have been populated with humor since the earliest seasons, and the practice became more elaborate as the production pipeline became more sophisticated, and as the home video era created an audience capable of studying individual frames. The Springfield Graveyard, which appears in multiple episodes across the entire run, contains dozens of individual headstone inscriptions, each one a small self-contained joke visible for only a fraction of a second in normal playback. Names and epitaphs have been documented by fans who went through the footage frame by frame, and the collection reveals the unmistakable voice of the show's writing staff applied to the most constrained possible format. The school cafeteria menu board at Springfield Elementary, visible in background shots, contains menu items that are jokes about public school food culture. The shelves of the Quick E-Mart contain product names that are elaborate parodies of real convenience store goods. The Springfield Nuclear Power Plant's safety bulletin board, visible in scenes set at the plant, contains notices that are, if you can read them, either deeply alarming descriptions of actual safety failures or deeply funny parodies of corporate safety communication, usually both simultaneously. Fact 62. The address of the Simpson family home, 742 Evergreen Terrace, has been confirmed by the production as the official canonical address of the family across the show's entire run. The number was chosen to feel like a realistic suburban address, specific enough to sound real without being associated with any actual geographic location. The address appears on mail the family receives, on official documents that appear in episodes, and on the mailbox visible in exterior shots of the house. Its consistency across the show's run is unusual given the show's general attitude toward continuity, and suggests that the production team considered the address one of the grounding details worth actively maintaining. The street name, Evergreen Terrace, was chosen with similar logic. It is the kind of street name that exists in virtually every American suburb, generic enough to feel familiar to viewers across the country regardless of their specific regional backgrounds. Fact 63. The interior of the Simpson house is architecturally impossible, and this has been established gradually across hundreds of episodes and then maintained as a deliberate feature rather than corrected as an embarrassing accident. Different episodes establish the house's interior in ways that contradict each other. The living room is sometimes very large and sometimes quite small, depending on what the scene requires. The staircase leads to a second floor whose spatial relationship to the first floor does not hold constant across episodes. The basement exists in some episodes and has never been mentioned in others. This impossibility began as an accident of episodic production, where different production teams made independent decisions about the space without reference to a shared canonical floor plan. Over time, it became a deliberate feature, something the show maintained because the Simpson house is a space that is always exactly the right size for the story being told in it. This is not a property any real building possesses, but it is the perfect property for a home in a cartoon. Fact 64. The chalkboard gag, in which Bart writes a repeated sentence on a classroom blackboard as the opening title sequence plays, has been one of the show's most flexible creative spaces across its entire run. The gag was originally a single repeated visual joke in the title sequence. Over time, the specific sentences became a parallel text to the episode that followed, sometimes directly relevant to the episode's theme, sometimes completely unrelated, sometimes pointed enough to function as standalone social commentary. The chalkboard has been used to acknowledge real-world events in ways that would have been awkward to include in the body of an episode. Deaths of significant contributors to the show have been acknowledged there. Social events that the production wanted to mark without building a full story around them have appeared on that blackboard. The chalkboard is the place where the production speaks most directly as itself, rather than as the characters and the fictional world they inhabit. Fact 65. The evolution of the show's animation style across its history represents one of the most significant visual transformations in the history of a continuing television series. The animation of the first season is so different from the animation of recent seasons that a viewer who saw only clips from each without context might initially struggle to identify them as the same program. The character models have been standardized and refined across decades. The movement has become more fluid and more expressively detailed. The color palette has shifted. The backgrounds have become denser with visual information. The most significant single technological transition occurred around season 20, when the show moved from standard definition to high-definition production. The move to high definition required not just a technical upgrade, but a visual rethinking of how the show's world was rendered, because details that had been invisible at standard definition became visible at the higher resolution. The production used the transition as an opportunity to revisit and refine the visual standard at every level. Fact 66. The Simpsons movie required the production to develop visual approaches specifically designed to distinguish a theatrical feature from a television episode while remaining recognizably the same show. The solution was to increase the level of detail and dimensionality in the film's backgrounds and environments without changing the fundamental character designs of the main family. The Springfield that appears in the film is more textured, more three-dimensionally convincing in its visual impression, more densely populated with visual information than the television Springfield. The dome that serves as the film's central story device was a significant technical challenge. The production team worked extensively on how to render glass at the scale and in the visual style of the show, how to create the effect of a transparent barrier covering an entire town in a way that was both legible and aesthetically consistent with the show's established visual language. Fact 67. Burns Manor, the estate of Mr. Burns, is one of the most visually elaborate recurring locations in the show, and its design incorporates architectural references spanning multiple historical periods in ways that coexist without being reconciled into any coherent single style. Elements of Gothic Revival, Victorian Gothic, and Gilded Age American excess exist within the same building in ways that are architecturally incoherent but visually coherent as a portrait of accumulated wealth across more than a century of occupancy. The building looks as though it has been expanded and modified across many decades, which is precisely what makes sense given Burns's established timeline. The design team reportedly researched the actual architecture of Gilded Age American mansions to ensure the visual details felt grounded, even as the overall impression remained deliberately excessive and slightly threatening. Fact 68. The Treehouse of Horror episodes, which have aired annually around Halloween since the second season, operate under a visually expanded set of rules that allow the production to attempt things the regular episode format would not support. The segments in these episodes regularly employ visual parodies of specific films, television shows, and horror traditions, parodies that require the animation team to study and absorb elements of the source material's specific visual grammar before transforming them into the show's visual language. The production teams for the Halloween episodes have described the work as among the most technically engaging they do all year, partly because the visual problem-solving is more varied and more demanding than the relatively standardized work of producing regular episodes, and partly because the creative latitude available in the Halloween format attracts additional creative investment and ambition. Fact 69. The specific shade of blue that defines Marge's hair has been treated by the production as a canonical fixed point across every technology transition in the show's history. The Marge blue, as it has been called informally within the production, is one of a small number of visual elements that have been actively protected from drift as animation technology changed and color rendering became more complex. Every time the show's production pipeline changed in ways that affected color output, the team verified that the Marge blue had survived the transition accurately. The height of the hair, which has no physical or biological explanation available within the show's fiction, was established in the character's original design as a visual signature functioning similarly to Homer's stubble or Lisa's spiky star points. It is the immediately readable silhouette that identifies Marge before any other visual information has been consciously processed. Fact 70. Several animators who worked on the show across its earlier seasons embedded their own likenesses in crowd scenes as a private form of professional signature. This is a tradition with deep roots in classical animation, where artists working on large-scale productions found ways to include small private marks in the work they would never receive public credit for. The practice in Simpsons animation has been documented by fans who identified specific background crowd members as portraits of specific production staff members, with confirmations coming from the animators themselves rather than from official production documentation. Fact 71. The nuclear power plant's visual dominance of the Springfield landscape has been one of the most consistently maintained visual details across the show's entire run. The cooling towers are always visible. The plant is always prominent in establishing shots of Springfield's exterior environment. Its presence in the background of views over the town is not subtle, and the production team has maintained that dominance deliberately. Every shot that establishes Springfield from the outside positions the plant as the most prominent feature of the landscape. This is not an accident of early design decisions that was simply continued for consistency. It is a sustained visual argument about the relationship between the town and the institution that powers it. Fact 72. The specific way the show renders Homer's expressions of physical suffering has become one of its most recognizable visual signatures and has been studied and absorbed by animators in other productions who recognized it as a genuinely innovative set of solutions to the problem of rendering. Interiority in a cartoon face, Homer's face when he is in pain, terrified, or encountering something beyond his cognitive capacity to process contorts in ways that are exaggerated far beyond anatomical realism and that are specifically funny rather than simply grotesque. The animators developed a vocabulary of Homer facial expressions that communicate specific emotional states instantly and universally. That vocabulary has been recognized outside the show as a significant contribution to the craft of character animation. Fact 73. The background paintings that establish the visual environment of each scene are created by a dedicated team of background artists across the show's entire run. These artists work from reference photographs, from architectural research, and from the specific visual needs of each episode's story, producing detailed paintings that appear on screen for fractions of the episode's runtime, but that are essential to each scene's visual credibility. The background of a Simpsons episode is never simply a backdrop. It is a rendered environment with its own character and its own informational content, and the team that produces these environments has maintained a consistent visual standard across decades of production and multiple technology transitions. Fact 74. The couch gag sequences that have been produced as standalone short films and distributed outside the conventional episode context represent some of the most formally ambitious material associated with the show's brand. The Banksy-directed couch gag that aired as part of a regular episode in 2010 depicted a factory where Simpsons merchandise was being produced under conditions the sequence portrayed as exploitative. Fox broadcast it. The fact of a major network broadcasting an animated critique of its own industry's manufacturing practices, embedded within one of its most commercially valuable properties, remains one of the more remarkable moments in the show's long history. Fact 75. Several of the show's most memorable visual sequences were achieved through techniques that were improvised solutions to production challenges rather than pre-planned creative choices. The specific look of certain dream sequences and fantastical episodes was developed in response to specific production constraints that required the team to find creative solutions rather than follow established procedures. The discipline of working within constraints and finding something inventive inside them has been one of the productive tensions in the show's production across its entire run. Fact 76. The fonts used in Springfield's signage have been cataloged by typography enthusiasts who have studied the show. The show uses a consistent set of hand-drawn lettering styles for different categories of signage, and these styles have become so associated with the program that encountering them in other contexts produces an immediate Simpsons association. The lettering on Moe's Tavern, the Quick E-Mart, and Springfield Elementary are all sufficiently distinct from each other that they function as visual character for their respective locations, adding to the sense that Springfield is a fully realized place with its own visual culture rather than a generic animated backdrop. Fact 77. The specific texture of Homer's skin, that particular quality of slightly elastic, slightly translucent yellow, evolved across the show's early seasons from a simpler, flatter rendering to something with more implied dimensionality and physical presence. The evolution was driven by improvements in the show's coloring process and by the animator's increasing familiarity with what the character needed to feel physically present in a scene. Homer needs to feel like he has genuine weight and mass, like he occupies physical space in ways that more slender characters do not. The skin rendering is part of how that physical presence is communicated, and the team has refined it consistently across decades of production. Fact 78. There is a recurring visual motif in episodes written by certain specific writers where the camera lingers briefly on a background detail that seems inconsequential and then cuts away before any joke or explicit explanation is provided. This technique, showing the viewer something and then leaving them to decide what it means, is a form of visual comedy that trusts the audience to supply the humor from their own imagination. It is one of the harder comedic techniques to execute, because it requires confidence that the viewer is curious enough to be genuinely bothered by an unanswered visual question. The Simpsons has used this technique more consistently and more successfully than most comedies. Fact 79. The sky over Springfield changes in subtle ways from episode to episode, in ways that correspond loosely to the emotional character of the story being told. Episodes set during moments of community warmth tend toward softer amber light. Episodes with darker subject matter tend toward overcast or flat gray. Episodes that are straightforwardly comedic tend toward clear, bright blue. This is not entirely consistent, but the tendency is present often enough that it functions as a kind of visual emotional priming that operates below the level of conscious perception for most viewers. Fact 80. The final frames of episodes, in the brief gap before the production logo appears, have been used across the show's history as spaces for visual jokes intended specifically for frame-by-frame viewers. These frames were placed before the home video era made frame-by-frame analysis widely accessible to ordinary audiences, which means their original placement was partly aspirational, a bet that attentive viewers who could slow down the footage would eventually find what had been hidden there. The rise of home video, then DVD, then streaming with pause functionality proved the bet correct. The jokes in the final frames have been found, cataloged, shared, and celebrated by fans who specifically went looking for them. Number, Section 5. Guest stars, cameos, and celebrity stories. Fact 81. Michael Jackson appeared in The Simpsons at his own request. He was a devoted and enthusiastic fan of the show who contacted the production to express his genuine interest in participating. The producers, who were surprised by the inquiry, developed an episode around his involvement. The episode, Stark Raving Dad, aired in the third season and featured Jackson playing a large white man named Leon Kompowski, who sincerely believes himself to be Michael Jackson. The joke worked on multiple levels simultaneously. Jackson was credited under the pseudonym John J. Smith. The production maintained the fiction of his non-involvement for years after the episode aired, though the voice was immediately recognizable to anyone who listened carefully. The episode itself was warm and funny, built around a scene in which Jackson's character helps Bart compose a birthday song for Lisa, and it was widely regarded as one of the season's finest achievements. After Jackson's death in 2009, the episode was re-evaluated in the context of the documentary Leaving Neverland and the serious accusations it presented. In 2019 Volution, the production announced its removal from rotation and streaming platforms. The episode still exists in the world. The context surrounding it changed in ways the production determined made continued circulation inappropriate. Fact 82. Leonard Nimoy appeared in the show twice, and both appearances were built around his cultural identity as Spock from Star Trek, an association so complete and so deep by the 90s that the show could use it as a visual and verbal shorthand without any elaboration required. His first appearance, in the Season 4 episode Marge vs. the Monorail, is the more celebrated. Nimoy arrived at the recording session in notably high spirits according to people present, and brought a specifically deadpan gravity to the role of celebrity endorser of Springfield's doomed transportation project that was exactly what the episode needed. The final joke of the episode, in which Nimoy's character observes that his work in Springfield is done and is immediately beamed away in a transporter effect, was reportedly improvised on the day of recording. The writers had taken the scene as far as they could on the page, and Nimoy found in the moment of performance the specific button the scene needed. The joke was kept exactly as he delivered it. Fact 83. Johnny Cash's appearance in The Simpsons was as a coyote in a spiritual dream sequence, which is either a perfectly appropriate or perfectly absurd vehicle for one of the most recognizable voices in American music, depending on your perspective. The episode El Viaje Misterioso de Nuestro Homer, which aired in Season 8, is one of the most formally unusual in the show's history. It is built around Homer eating an extraordinarily hot chili pepper at a community cook-off that produces a sustained spiritual hallucination in which he explores a surreal desert landscape searching for his true soulmate. The coyote that Cash voices in the sequence functions as Homer's spirit guide, a creature of ancient wisdom who speaks to Homer in oblique terms about the fundamental questions of his life. Cash brought to the performance a quality that is genuinely difficult to describe, beyond noting that it was completely specific to him. Weathered, sun-worn, unhurried, something that made the coyote feel like a creature from a different and older world than the one Homer normally inhabits. The episode has been described by multiple critics as aesthetically distinctive enough to stand apart from the rest of the show's catalog, and Cash's voice is central to what makes it feel that way. Fact 84. Dustin Hoffman appeared in a Season 2 episode under the pseudonym Sam Eddick, in what is widely considered one of the most emotionally effective guest performances in the show's history. He voiced Mr. Bergstrom, a substitute teacher who enters Lisa's life for a single episode and becomes, within that episode, the most significant adult influence she has encountered outside her family. The episode, Lisa's Substitute, treats the intensity of a child's attachment to a genuinely gifted teacher with a seriousness that is unusual in any form of television, let alone in a primetime animated comedy. Hoffman did not approach the role as a guest appearance in the conventional sense. He spent considerable time with the script and with the emotional logic of the character before recording, approaching the work with the investment he would bring to a substantial film role. The result is a performance that carries genuine weight, that makes Mr. Bergstrom feel like a real person whose departure from Lisa's life is a real and consequential loss. The episode made adult viewers cry in numbers that surprised even the production team. Fact 85. Paul McCartney's appearance in the Season 7 episode Lisa the Vegetarian came with a specific contractual condition that has no known precedent in the show's history. McCartney agreed to participate only on the condition that the production committed, in writing, to never reversing Lisa's decision to stop eating meat. He would lend his voice and his cultural authority to an episode about a character choosing vegetarianism only if that choice was treated as permanent, rather than as a momentary story beat to be walked back for a joke in a subsequent season. The production agreed to the condition. Lisa Simpson has been a vegetarian in every episode since the Season 7 story aired, a commitment maintained across more than 2 decades of subsequent production. McCartney has verified this story in multiple interviews. His appearance in the episode, along with Linda McCartney, Elvis Costello, and Ringo Starr, remains one of the most celebrated celebrity segments in the show's history. Fact 86. David Bowie was approached about appearing on the show at multiple points across the 1990s and early 2000s, and declined each time. The specific nature of his declinations has been described differently by different people connected to the production, with accounts ranging from scheduling conflicts to creative incompatibility to a simply firm and unexplained refusal. Bowie was protective of his public persona in ways that made him highly selective about the contexts in which he allowed himself to be directly referenced or gently mocked. His absence from the show stands out specifically because almost everyone else of comparable cultural prominence from the same era eventually appeared. The list of people who did participate is long enough that not being on it, for someone of Bowie's profile, carries its own weight as a fact. Fact 87. Stephen Hawking appeared on the show 4 times across different seasons. He seemed to approach each appearance as an opportunity for a specific kind of generous self-deprecation, a willingness to allow his public image as the world's most famous theoretical physicist to be used as comedic material in ways that required genuine security in his own identity. In several of his appearances, the comedy depends specifically on the contrast between his status as one of the most intelligent people alive and the utter absurdity of the Springfield context he has been placed in. He spoke in interviews about his relationship to the show with warmth and dry amusement that suggested genuine affection for what the production was doing. He considered the association with The Simpsons one of the more enjoyable and least predictable aspects of his public life. Fact 88. When Aerosmith appeared in the Season 3 episode Flaming Moe's, the logistics of recording their lines were significantly more complicated than a standard guest appearance. The band members were not in the same city on any of the days available for recording, and coordinating their schedules to bring them to a single facility was not feasible within the production timeline. The recordings were therefore made at multiple locations across different days, with band members recording their lines individually at local studios or by phone, and the final ensemble was assembled in post-production. The production staff described the process as more logistically demanding than any previous guest appearance they had managed. The final product gives no indication of the complicated process that produced it, which is precisely the point. Fact 89. Kim Basinger and Alec Baldwin appeared together in the Season 9 episode When You Dish Upon a Star, playing themselves as minor celebrities seeking privacy in Springfield. The episode was produced during their marriage. The dynamic between the characters they play carries a specific comedic texture that is inseparable from the real relationship the audience knows exists between the people performing it. The episode aired in October of 1998. Basinger and Baldwin divorced in 2002, which means the episode now exists in a different emotional context from the one it was produced in. The specific comedy of their shared performance has acquired a dimension it did not originally carry. Fact 90. Phil Hartman voiced two of the most beloved recurring characters in the show's history, Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz, and when he died in 1998, the production retired both characters rather than recast them. They simply did not appear in subsequent episodes. No explanation was offered within the show's fiction. The characters had existed, and then they did not, and the absence was itself a form of tribute. Troy McClure, the washed-up actor whose film credits were invariably suspicious, worked because Hartman performed him with absolute and unironic sincerity. There was no acknowledgement that the character was ridiculous. Hartman inhabited his complete self-belief and let the comedy arise from the gap between what the character believed about himself and what the audience could plainly see. That gap belonged specifically to Hartman. It could not be reconstructed by anyone else. Fact 91. Tony Blair's appearance on the show during his tenure as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in 2003 was one of several instances across the show's history in which a sitting head of government agreed to appear in a fictional context that required at least a degree of willingness to be gently satirized. Blair's willingness to participate in a mainstream American animated comedy while serving as Prime Minister was itself a form of cultural statement, and it was noted by commentators on both sides of the Atlantic as significant. The episode did not address the specific political climate of that moment directly. It did not need to. The appearance was the statement. Fact 92. Werner Herzog appeared on the show in a role that was written with an awareness of his public persona as a filmmaker associated with outsized creative ambition and a philosophical gravity that could shade, in the right context, into unintentional comedy. Herzog performed the role with a willingness to participate in the self-referential quality of the casting that was, by all accounts, completely genuine. He found the whole enterprise amusing in exactly the ways the writers hoped he would, and he brought to the performance a quality of bemused and slightly weary seriousness that enhanced the joke rather than merely supporting it. Fact 93. Thomas Pynchon, the notoriously reclusive American novelist who has avoided public appearances and photographs for his entire career, appeared in The Simpsons twice. He voiced a character who, in the show's fiction, wore a paper bag over his head. The joke was that the show's universe gave Pynchon a way to appear while maintaining his real-world anonymity. The character's visual concealment referenced Pynchon's actual commitment to invisibility in the real world. The casting was a perfect match of celebrity identity and comedic concept. The bag over the head is one of the show's most perfectly constructed visual gags precisely because it encapsulates something true about the person it is built around. Fact 94. Jon Lovitz holds a notable record among non-cast members in terms of the variety of distinct roles he has voiced on the show. He has appeared in multiple different characters across different seasons, each one a separate characterization rather than a recurring appearance as the same person. His range within the show's specific comedic register has been deployed consistently over the years, and his appearances have generally functioned as genuine contributions to specific episodes rather than as celebrity cameos in the more superficial sense. The show has used him as a performer rather than as a name. Fact 95. Ringo Starr appeared in a Season 3 episode and was, according to people present at the recording session, consistently cheerful and thoroughly professional throughout the experience. He has said in interviews that the invitation to participate in the show meant something genuinely significant to him because of the show's specific cultural status and because of his own sense of humor, which has always run to a particular kind of warm and self-deprecating absurdism that is entirely compatible with the show's sensibility. Of all the Beatles, he is the one whose public personality fits most naturally into the world of Springfield. Fact 96. The record for the most prominent cultural figure to consistently decline a Simpsons appearance across the show's entire run is probably held by Bob Dylan, who was approached at various points across different decades and never agreed. Dylan's relationship with mainstream popular culture has always been defined by strategic and principled withdrawal from exactly the kind of ubiquitous cultural institution The Simpsons represents. His continued absence from the show is, in its own way, a consistent statement about his relationship to that kind of cultural ubiquity, and it is characteristic enough of his public persona that it feels entirely appropriate. Fact 97. Neil Young's appearance in the Season 8 episode Homerpalooza was notable partly for the ease with which he seemed to inhabit the show's specific comedic environment. Young is not generally known for a willingness to be placed in absurdist fictional contexts or to participate in gentle self-parody, but his participation in the episode was reported to have been enthusiastic and straightforward. He brought to the performance the same quality of understatement that defines his music, a quality that translated well into the specific comic context the episode created around him. He was playing a version of himself in a situation that was obviously ridiculous, and he played it with the same unhurried seriousness he brings to everything. Fact 98. The animated Simpsons format has allowed the show to depict interactions between celebrities and scenarios involving public figures that would have been impossible or impractical in live-action production, either because the people involved were not available simultaneously, or because the specific circumstances depicted required creative license beyond what documentary or interview formats could accommodate. The animation removes certain real-world constraints while adding others. It allows the production to place a person in Springfield with a freedom that no other format would permit. Fact 99. Several planned guest appearances across the show's history were canceled or significantly delayed by the death of the intended performer before recording could be completed. The production has managed each of these situations differently depending on the circumstances and the degree to which production had advanced. In some cases, recorded material was not used out of respect for the person and the circumstances of their death. In other cases, the episode was rewritten to work around the absence. These decisions are not publicized, but they are part of the show's private history across 36 years. Fact 100. The show's catalog of guest appearances, spanning more than 3 decades, now functions as a kind of index of American and international cultural prominence across different eras. The guest stars of the early 1990s reflect a specific map of who mattered in American entertainment and culture in that particular moment. The guest stars of the early 2000s reflect a different map. The guest stars of the current era reflect yet another. Taken together, the guest catalog is a record of changing cultural capital across the show's entire history, a secondary archive of American celebrity that exists alongside and inside the show's primary archive of episodes and stories. Number. Section 6. The Music of Springfield. Fact 101. The Simpsons has produced more original musical compositions than any other scripted television series in history. Estimates of the total catalog vary depending on methodology and on what counts as a complete song versus a brief melodic fragment, but even conservative calculations produce a number well above 200 original pieces across the show's run. Many of these compositions were written for a single scene in a single episode, created specifically to serve one story moment and never heard again in any other context. Others have taken on independent cultural lives, becoming artifacts that exist in the broader world entirely separately from the episodes that produce them. The sheer volume of original music the show has commissioned and produced is remarkable. Most television series rely predominantly on licensed music and orchestral score, producing relatively little original composition. The Simpsons has consistently commissioned original work for both its musical episode content and its orchestral underscore, resulting in a catalog of genuine size and range that has no parallel in scripted television. Fact 102. Alf Clausen composed the orchestral score for The Simpsons across its first 27 seasons. This tenure, from the show's debut in 1989 through season 28 in 2017, represents one of the longest composer-to-show relationships in American television history. Clausen scored more than 500 episodes across nearly 3 decades, developing in the process an intimate knowledge of the show's specific musical needs and an ability to work quickly and precisely within the production's demanding timeline. Clausen worked with live orchestras for the majority of his tenure. Each episode's score was recorded by an ensemble of professional musicians assembled specifically for the Simpsons sessions, musicians who over years developed a familiarity with the show's musical language and with Clausen's working methods that produced a specific consistency in the sonic texture. When the production announced his departure in 2017, the announcement was received with significant criticism from fans and music industry professionals who understood what his nearly 3-decade contribution had meant to the show's identity. Fact 103. Do the Bartman, the pop single released in 1990 and performed in character by Nancy Cartwright as Bart Simpson, reached #1 on the charts in several countries. In Australia, where the show had developed an unusually large and devoted early audience, the single spent time at the top of the charts alongside mainstream pop releases and became a genuine cultural event rather than simply a novelty item. The single has a production quality and energy that holds up as a piece of late 1980s pop music, even when encountered entirely without its Simpsons context. Michael Jackson co-wrote Do the Bartman with Brian Loren. His involvement was not officially confirmed for years after the single's release. He was not credited, partly for contractual reasons related to his existing recording contract. The confirmation of his co-writing credit came years later. Fact 104. The Monorail song, written for the Marge vs. the Monorail episode, is the most discussed and celebrated piece of original music the show has produced across its entire history. It was composed in the style of classic American musical theater, specifically in the tradition of Rodgers and Hammerstein, and it functions simultaneously as a precise parody of that form and as a genuinely entertaining piece of music that works on its own terms. Phil Hartman's vocal performance as Lyle Lanley, the con man selling Springfield its doomed transportation project, was so completely committed to the theatrical style of the song that it exists in a category above parody. It is a fully realized performance of a certain kind of music by a character who is performing that music within the story, and the layers of that performance are what make the joke work at multiple levels simultaneously. The song is quoted and sung by fans at gatherings 30 years after it was written for a single television episode. Fact 105. The show's relationship with classical music has been developed through Lisa Simpson's character in ways that are more substantive than the standard animated television approach to any cultural subject. Lisa plays the saxophone with a commitment that the show has treated as genuine and central to who she is throughout its run. Her relationship to music is depicted as an essential part of her identity, not simply a character detail to be invoked when a plot requires it. The specific pieces of classical music chosen to accompany scenes involving Lisa have been selected with an awareness of what those pieces mean within the Western classical canon, and with an understanding of how the character's specific emotional relationship to music would inform what she would listen to and what she would feel when she listened. The musical vocabulary built around Lisa across hundreds of episodes is consistent and specific enough that it constitutes a genuine artistic position about what music means to a certain kind of person. Fact 106. Danny Elfman composed the show's opening theme in under 2 days, a fact that is worth revisiting with the attention it deserves. The theme is a complex piece of music. It has a memorable melodic hook that has embedded itself in the cultural memory of multiple generations. It has a specific orchestral texture that manages to feel simultaneously retro and contemporary. It has a rhythmic energy that is sustained across its full length without becoming monotonous. It has an emotional quality that is genuinely difficult to categorize, occupying a space that is neither straightforwardly cheerful nor straightforwardly anxious, but somehow both at once, which is exactly the right combination for a show that is simultaneously a family comedy and a sustained satire of American domestic life. Elfman has described the composition process as unusually intuitive. The melody arrived quickly and essentially complete. The orchestration followed with similar speed. He has said that working on the Simpsons theme was one of the experiences in his career where the creative act felt less like construction and more like discovery. Fact 107. Homer's musical life within the show has been more developed than his character's cognitive profile might initially suggest. Homer has a surprisingly committed relationship to singing, even if the quality of the commitment exceeds the quality of the voice. His performances in the Homer's Barbershop Quartet episode, in which he leads a group of Springfield men through a story modeled on the Beatles' career arc, were genuine musical performances that required Dan Castellaneta to sing in a sustained way across multiple scenes. He did so with an investment that surprised people who knew Homer, primarily as a character of broad physical comedy and cognitive limitation. The episode proved that Homer could inhabit a musical story with genuine feeling, and that the comedy of his involvement in music was not simply about being bad at it. Fact 108. The end credits music of The Simpsons, which has been heard by every person who has watched an episode through to its conclusion, deserves more individual attention than it typically receives. It is a separate composition from the opening theme, written by Elfman with a distinctly different character. Where the theme is energized and slightly driven, the credits music is settled and comfortable. It is looser, jazzier, more relaxed in its rhythmic feel. It marks the transition from the episode's world back to the viewer's own, with the precision of a well-designed emotional signal. The specific combination of instruments and the quality of the melody creates a sound that is simultaneously familiar and slightly melancholy, which is exactly what you want from music that accompanies the end of something you have enjoyed. Fact 109. The Flaming Moe's jingle, which plays in the episode of the same name whenever the bar's signature cocktail is ordered, was written to evoke the specific sonic aesthetic of 1980s American commercial music. It sounds like an advertising jingle from that era because the people who wrote it had lived through that era and could reproduce its musical grammar from memory with the same precision a painter might reproduce a specific light. The joke works because the music is accurate. The parody lands because the target has been precisely identified before it has been precisely reproduced. Fact 110. Several episodes across the show's history have been built around original songs of a quality that would be entirely at home in a legitimate theatrical production. The show's writers, several of whom had academic or personal backgrounds in musical theater, brought to these compositions a structural sophistication that went well beyond what most television comedies achieved in the same period. The songs in the musical episodes are not merely funny. They are dramatically functional in the ways that songs in genuine musicals are supposed to be, advancing character and story simultaneously in ways that dialogue alone could not accomplish. The best of them work because they do multiple things at once. Fact 111. The specific way that music functions within the Simpsons universe, supporting comedy, carrying emotion, commenting on the action, has been studied and analyzed by music scholars and film theorists in ways that have produced a genuine body of academic work on the subject. The show's use of music to create a gap between the emotional signal the music sends and the emotional signal the action sends is a technique the production team developed with unusual sophistication across the show's early seasons. The music is never simply accompaniment in the best Simpsons episodes. It is always making an argument about how to feel about what you are watching, and that argument is sometimes in agreement with the action and sometimes productively in tension with it. Fact 112. The orchestra that recorded Alf Clausen's scores across nearly 3 decades was a regular ensemble of professional musicians who worked specifically and repeatedly with The Simpsons production. These musicians, over many years, developed a specific intimacy with the show's musical language and with Clausen's working methods that produced a consistency in the sonic texture that a rotating pool of session musicians would not have achieved. They knew how Clausen worked. They understood the comedic function of music in the episodes. They had played these kinds of cues for these kinds of scenes enough times to bring a specific institutional knowledge to every session. The dissolution of this ensemble following Clausen's departure was lamented by several of its members in interviews conducted at the time. Fact 113. The theme from The Simpsons has been performed at Carnegie Hall and at major concert venues around the world. Danny Elfman has been present at multiple such performances and has spoken about the strangeness of watching a piece of music he wrote in 2 days become a concert hall staple, performed by major orchestras before audiences who dressed formally for the occasion. The theme has acquired a cultural weight that Elfman has acknowledged he could not have anticipated when he was writing it against a very tight deadline. It has become something that people have genuine feelings about, an emotional shorthand for a specific experience of late 20th century American life that transcends its original context as the opening of a cartoon comedy. Fact 114. The show has periodically referenced and incorporated real popular music in ways that generated specific responses from the musicians referenced. Some of these responses were enthusiastic, some were bemused, and some were negative enough to generate formal correspondence with the production. The production has generally been responsive to concerns raised by musicians about specific depictions, while maintaining the show's right to satirize public cultural figures, which is the established right of any satirical publication or broadcast in the American media landscape. The negotiations between that right and the reasonable expectations of the people being satirized have been a recurring feature of the show's relationship with popular music across its history. Fact 115. Alf Clausen's departure from the show in 2017 was accompanied by a transition in the show's musical approach that moved away from the live orchestra model he had built over nearly 3 decades. The production shifted toward a more contemporary production approach that incorporated synthesized elements alongside a smaller live ensemble. The change was audible to attentive listeners and was widely discussed in the fan community as one of the most significant alterations to the show's overall sonic identity in its history. Whether the change represented an improvement, a neutral update, or a meaningful loss depends on what you value most about the show's musical character. That it represented a significant change is not in dispute. Number. Section 7. Deleted scenes, cut episodes, and lost stories. Fact 116. The Simpsons production archive contains more cut material than almost any other long-running television series in American broadcasting history. The show's production process involves multiple rounds of editing at the script stage, at the animation stage, and at the post-production stage, and each round produces cuts. Some of this cut material is brief, a single joke that did not land in context, a scene that was technically polished but slowed the episode's rhythm. Some of it is substantial, entire act structures reworked, extended sequences fully animated and then replaced with shorter alternatives, story developments that went in a completely different direction in the final episode than in earlier drafts. The material released officially through DVD special features gives a sense of the shape of this archive. But the archive is substantially larger than what has been released. It is a significant record of how the show developed and revised its stories across every season of its production. The cut material is not simply the weaker version of what made it to air. Some of it is genuinely interesting, and some of it is arguably stronger than what replaced it. Fact 117. An early draft of the Marge versus the Monorail episode contained a more elaborate and extended sequence documenting Lyle Lanley's previous monorail schemes in other American towns before his arrival in Springfield. The sequence was longer and more specific than what appeared in the final episode, with more developed depictions of how each previous town was deceived and what was left behind for each community to manage after Lanley moved on. The sequence was cut because it pushed the episode past its runtime, and because the writers determined that the point was made efficiently enough in the shorter version. The cut sequence exists in the production archive, and has been described by writers who worked on the episode as among the stronger material that did not survive the editing process. Fact 118. The complete alternate ending to the Who Shot Mr. Burns storyline, in which Waylon Smithers is revealed as the shooter rather than Maggie Simpson, was produced to a standard that would have been entirely broadcast ready. It was fully animated, fully voiced by the cast, and fully scored by Alf Clausen. The decision to go with the Maggie ending was made relatively late in the production process, meaning the Smithers version existed as a complete alternative at the time the Maggie version was being finalized. The alternate ending was subsequently shown to the public within a clip show episode, presented as the conclusion the show had considered and deliberately rejected. The presentation of a complete alternate ending within the show's own broadcast was an unusual act of self-commentary that is rare in television history. The Smithers version is dramatically coherent in ways that have continued to fuel debate about whether the Maggie ending was the correct creative choice. Fact 119. Several premises developed through multiple draft stages and then abandoned are known within the fan community because writers have described them in DVD commentaries, convention panels, and interviews over the years. One such premise involved Homer discovering genuine evidence of systematic wrongdoing at the nuclear plant, taking that evidence seriously and pursuing it through legitimate channels. The premise was developed far enough to produce multiple written drafts before the writing team determined that the story required Homer to sustain a level of competence and sustained initiative that was incompatible with the character as established across preceding seasons while still being funny. The best individual jokes from those drafts were distributed into other stories over subsequent seasons. Fact 120. The Camp Krusty episode, which aired as a Season 4 finale, represents the most significant example of material developed at one scale and then produced at a substantially smaller one. The story was initially conceived as a potential premise for the first Simpsons theatrical feature film. A longer-form version of the story was developed through multiple drafts, building out the premise of Bart and Lisa being sent to a summer camp that turns into a nightmare of neglect and exploitation, with movie-scale stakes and movie-length storytelling space. When the premise was deemed too contained for a feature film audience's expectations, the best version of it was adapted into a single episode. The result is one of the show's most beloved episodes, but the archive contains a record of the larger version it was originally meant to be. Fact 121. The Principal and the Pauper episode, which revealed that Principal Skinner was an imposter named Armin Tamzarian, was developed through drafts that explored different ways of handling the revelation and its aftermath. The most controversial element of the finished episode, the town's collective legal decision to maintain the lie and physically expel the real Seymour Skinner, was present in early drafts in a somewhat more muted form. The decision to push the episode to its most extreme logical conclusion, to show the community explicitly and legally choosing comfortable fiction over verifiable truth, was a deliberate escalation the room made late in the development process. Harry Shearer, who voices Skinner, was vocally opposed to the storyline both before and after it aired, a disagreement that has been documented and discussed publicly by multiple participants over the years since. Fact 122. The production has, at various points across its run, developed episodes that were abandoned mid-production when a world event rendered the story inappropriate for broadcast or difficult to air in its original form. The September 2001 attacks led to the delay and revision of at least one completed episode. Other world events across the show's long history have had similar effects, requiring the production to hold completed work until timing felt appropriate, or to revise finished material in ways that accommodated changed circumstances. The show's regular engagement with current events and social satire means that world events affect its production in ways that purely fictional productions without satirical intent are not subject to. Fact 123. The show has produced different versions of certain episodes for different international broadcast markets, with specific content adjusted to meet requirements or sensitivities in particular countries or regions. These regional variations are not always trivial cosmetic changes. In some cases, they involve alterations to jokes or story elements that meaningfully change what a scene is doing. The existence of multiple canonical versions of the same episode is an unusual fact about a show that is otherwise understood as having a single, definitive text in each of its episodes. Fact 124. The Homer's Triple Bypass episode, in which Homer undergoes open-heart surgery, originally contained a more extended sequence toward its conclusion that treated Homer's mortality with a directness that the room ultimately determined shifted the episode's tone in a way that did not serve the story. The version that eventually aired is warm and genuinely moving in its emotional arc. The cut material would have made it one of the most emotionally difficult episodes the show had attempted to that point in its run. The decision to pull back from that edge was made in the editing process, not in the writing process, which suggests it survived longer in the production pipeline than many creative decisions that were made earlier in development. Fact 125. Several couch gag sequences have been produced as standalone short films distributed outside the conventional episode context and represent some of the most formally ambitious material associated with the show's brand. These standalone couch gags, some of which run for several minutes, were produced by guest directors given unusual creative latitude to use The Simpsons' visual world as a canvas for something more personal or more formally experimental than a standard episode would accommodate. The Banksy-directed sequence from 2010 became a news story on its own terms when Fox broadcast it, because a major network had allowed the broadcasting of an animated critique of its own industry's practices, embedded within one of its most commercially valuable properties. Fact 126. A complete episode centered on Sideshow Bob's family was drafted, revised, placed on hold, reconsidered, and eventually produced in a form significantly different from the original draft. The episode that introduced Bob's aristocratic family members was conceived as a story about inherited villainy, about what it means to come from a lineage with a legacy of malevolence, and to choose whether to perpetuate or to reject that legacy. The first drafts of this story were reportedly darker in tone and more psychologically intense than what eventually aired. The final version was adjusted to maintain the specifically comedic register that makes Kelsey Grammer's performance as Bob sustainable as a recurring comedy presence rather than a purely dramatic one. Fact 127. The show's writers have described the experience of working on premises that live in development across multiple seasons before either being produced or finally abandoned as one of the more peculiar aspects of working on a show of the Simpsons' longevity. Ideas live in the collective memory of the writing room across seasons and across changes in the writing staff. A premise discussed and set aside in Season 9 might be revived and reconsidered in Season 15 and finally abandoned in Season 20. The history of the room's thinking about any given story idea is a history that spans years and involves people who no longer work on the show, carried forward through institutional memory and occasional archival reference. Fact 128. The production has on multiple occasions had to manage stories in development that were rendered superseded by real-world events that moved faster than the show's production timeline. A story about a specific technology or cultural phenomenon that was speculative when the episode was pitched sometimes became literally real before the episode could air. In some cases, the production revised the episode to address the changed reality. In other cases, the episode was aired as produced, with the understanding that the specific speculative element had become historical in the interval between writing and broadcast. The show's relationship with the real world is complicated throughout by the gap between the moment of writing and the moment of broadcast. Fact 129. Several guest star appearances were recorded but never used in finished episodes, for reasons ranging from the death of the performer before the episode could air to creative decisions made during production that removed the scenes the guest appeared in. In at least one documented case, recorded material from a performer who died during the show's production was not used out of respect for the person and the circumstances of their death, even though the material itself was technically usable. These decisions are not publicized, but they represent the private history of the show's management of loss across 36 years. Fact 130. The show's archive of unproduced premises, abandoned outlines, and cut material collectively represents an alternate history of The Simpsons that is probably as large as the actual history of the show in terms of sheer word count of written material. Every episode that was produced from a much larger body of material that was considered and rejected at various stages. The episodes we know represent the surviving fraction of a much larger creative effort, and the material that did not survive the editing process tells a story about the show's thinking and standards that the finished product alone cannot. Section 8. Real-world impact records and cultural footprint. Fact 131. The Simpsons holds 3 records simultaneously that have no precedent in American television history. It is the longest-running American animated series. It is the longest-running American sitcom. It is the longest-running American scripted primetime television program. These 3 records, each one individually remarkable, together constitute a dominance of the television landscape that has no parallel and, given the fragmentation of contemporary media across streaming platforms and viewing formats, is extremely unlikely ever to be repeated by any single series. The show has aired across the presidencies of 7 different American presidents. It has continued through technological revolutions that transformed how television is made, distributed, and watched. It has maintained network broadcast relevance through the rise of cable, satellite, streaming, social media, and on-demand viewing. Each of those transitions created conditions that ended or diminished major television properties. The Simpsons continued through all of them. Fact 132. The word dough, Homer's signature expression of frustration, was added to the Oxford English Dictionary in 2001. The decision to include it required the dictionary's editorial team to make a genuine determination about the boundary of the English language, whether a piece of invented television vocabulary, never appearing in print before the show aired, qualified for inclusion in a reference work whose standard for inclusion is established and widespread use. They determined that it did. The show had been running for more than a decade by that point, and the word had spread far enough into everyday English speech that it was being used by people who might not have been able to identify its origin if asked. The dictionary defines it as an exclamation used to comment on a foolish or stupid action, especially one's own. Homer's sound, trimmed from Castellaneta's original longer version through repeated takes, had become a word. Fact 133. The show's influence on American English extends well beyond the single formalized dictionary entry. Multiple words and phrases that originated on or were significantly popularized by The Simpsons have entered everyday usage to degrees documented by linguists and cultural commentators. The word meh, used to express indifference or mediocrity, has been traced in significant part to the show's use of it in ways that made its meaning immediately legible to mass audiences. Embiggen, a word invented for the show that appears in a single line of dialogue in a single episode, was added to the Merriam-Webster dictionary in 2018. The phrase perfectly cromulent, from the same episode that produced embiggen, entered everyday use as a way of endorsing something while acknowledging its slightly absurd quality. The show has contributed more to the active vocabulary of American English than any other single entertainment property in the history of the medium. Fact 134. Time magazine named The Simpsons the best television series of the 20th century in their year 2000 retrospective rankings. The ranking placed the show above every dramatic series, every documentary, every news program, and every other comedy that had aired across the entire 100-year history of the medium up to that point. The recognition was significant as a formal acknowledgement that animation could represent the medium's most significant artistic achievement in a given era, that a cartoon comedy could make legitimate claims on the highest registers of cultural importance that American culture had previously reserved for other forms. Fact 135. The Simpsons has received more Emmy Awards than any other animated series in television history. It has also received Peabody Awards, recognition from the Writers Guild of America and the Directors Guild of America, and numerous other professional honors across its run. The critical consensus at its peak, which lasted for several years in the mid-90s, was that the show was doing something singular in American television, inventing a form of comedy that had no true predecessors and that raised the standard of what a television comedy could achieve. That consensus has never been entirely withdrawn, even as subsequent seasons were received with more ambivalence. Fact 136. The licensing and merchandise business generated by The Simpsons at its commercial peak was substantial enough to represent a meaningful portion of Fox's total corporate revenue. At the height of the show's commercial dominance in the early 1990s, the Bart Simpson character was among the most extensively licensed characters in American popular culture, a status previously associated primarily with Disney properties. The licensing agreements covered clothing, toys, food products, bedding, school supplies, video games, and hundreds of other product categories. The breadth of the licensing program reflected the breadth of the show's cultural penetration. The Simpsons had become something that people wanted to carry into every corner of their daily lives, which is the strongest indicator of genuine cultural saturation. Fact 137. The Simpsons has been cited in academic papers across an unusually wide range of disciplines. Philosophy departments have built courses around specific episodes as illustrations of ethical arguments and thought experiments. Economics programs have used the show as a case study in behavioral economics and in the economics of institutional failure. Sociology departments have analyzed the show's depiction of the American working class, of small-town community dynamics, and of the relationship between individual agency and structural constraint. The show has been discussed in literature programs, media studies programs, and cultural studies programs across multiple countries. The volume of serious academic engagement with The Simpsons is substantial enough that a bibliography of published scholarship on it would run to dozens of pages. Fact 138. Springfield, USA, the themed area at Universal Studios Florida that opened in 2013, required the show's art team to confront visual decisions about the show's world that the television format had never required them to make. Translating animated architecture into physical buildings that guests could actually enter and move through meant confronting the show's deliberate visual inconsistencies directly and resolving them. The quick E-Mart depicted from one angle in one episode is not identical to the same building depicted from a different angle in a different episode. The team made choices that prioritized the most recognizable and most emotionally resonant version of each location, creating physical spaces that feel true to the show's world, even where they diverge from specific episode depictions. Fact 139. The Simpsons movie, released in 2007 after 18 years of the television series, grossed over $536 million at the worldwide box office against a production budget of approximately $75 million. It was a significant commercial success that demonstrated the show's audience was willing to engage with it in a theatrical context after nearly 2 decades of free television access. The film's commercial performance surprised some industry observers who had assumed that audiences would not pay for a theatrical version of something they could watch at home for free. The film demonstrated that the relationship between The Simpsons and its audience was not simply a habit of convenient free viewing, but something more invested. Fact 140. The Hollywood Walk of Fame star awarded to The Simpsons in 2009 was a symbolic acknowledgement of the show's transition from television program to cultural institution. The Walk of Fame star is typically awarded to individual performers, directors, or producers. A star for an animated television series as an entity, rather than for the individuals who made it, marked a recognition that the show had achieved a kind of cultural presence that exceeded what any single contributor to it had individually achieved. The show had become larger than the sum of its parts in a way that warranted its own form of recognition. Fact 141. The show's influence on subsequent American animated television is essentially the foundational fact of the primetime animated genre as it currently exists. Before The Simpsons, primetime animation was understood in America as a relic of the 1960s that had not found a contemporary audience. The Simpsons disproved this assumption definitively in its first season and continued disproving it for 3 decades. Every animated primetime comedy that came after it exists in a space that the show cleared and prepared. King of the Hill, Family Guy, American Dad, Bob's Burgers, Archer, and dozens of others all built on foundations The Simpsons laid. The genre did not exist in its current form before the show made it exist. Fact 142. The show's longevity has created a specific kind of multi-generational cultural relationship with its audience that is impossible to achieve in a shorter run. People who were children when the show began have grown up alongside it. People who were young adults when it first aired are now middle-aged. People who were born after the show started are now adults who have never lived in a world without The Simpsons. This multi-generational relationship is unique in American popular culture. The show is simultaneously a nostalgic object for those who grew up with it, a current cultural presence for those experiencing it now, and a historical artifact for those discovering it retrospectively. All 3 of these relationships are happening simultaneously in the same world to people who might be watching the same episode. Fact 143. The Simpsons has been used as a teaching tool in public health contexts with an effectiveness that reflects the show's unusual combination of broad accessibility and genuine intellectual engagement with social subjects. Homer's cardiac history has been referenced in campaigns about cardiovascular health. Lisa's vegetarianism has been cited in discussions of diet and environmental sustainability. The production has been selective about which public health partnerships it accepts, declining associations that would compromise the show's satirical voice by requiring its characters to function as straightforward advocates for institutional positions rather than as complex figures making their own choices. Fact 144. The show has generated an active fan community that has been cataloging and analyzing it for more than 30 years, producing in the process one of the most extensive secondary archives associated with any entertainment property. The SNPP database, which stands for Springfield Nuclear Power Plant and was established in the early Internet era, contains detailed documentation of every episode, character, cultural reference, and production detail the show has generated. It was built by people who were doing something genuinely new, treating a television comedy as a text worthy of sustained and serious archival attention. The academic community has since caught up to a conclusion the fan community reached years earlier. Fact 145. The show has been renewed through at least season 38, with no definitive end date announced by the production or the network. This continuation, after 36 seasons and nearly 800 episodes, means the show's total episode count will exceed 900 before any currently announced conclusion. The question of when and how The Simpsons should end, and what a proper conclusion for it would even look like, is one that the show's creators, critics, and fans have been debating for more than a decade. The show has shown no structural signs of imminently concluding. It continues, one episode at a time, each season. Number. Section 9. Behind the scenes, feuds, negotiations, and drama. Fact 146. The working relationship between Matt Groening and James L. Brooks, the two executive producers who have been with the show from its first episode through its current run, has been one of the most consequential creative partnerships in the history of American television. The two men come from different backgrounds, have different primary strengths, and have not always agreed on every creative decision the show has faced across more than 3 decades. Brooks brought the emotional ambition and the prestige television production sensibility. Groening brought the character logic, the satirical instinct, and the specific worldview from which the show's best material emerged. The productive tension between their orientations has been visible in the work across different eras of the show's history. When the balance between them is right, the show produces something simultaneously funnier and more emotionally resonant than either orientation alone could achieve. The history of the partnership is the history of negotiating that balance across hundreds of episodes across decades. Fact 147. Sam Simon, the third credited creator of The Simpsons, had a role in the show's formative years that has been consistently described as essential by people who worked alongside him. Simon was the showrunner who took Groening's characters and Brooks's emotional ambitions and figured out how to produce them as a running weekly television series. He developed the production infrastructure, the working methods, the specific practices of the writing room that defined the show's creative culture in its earliest and most influential period. His departure after the 4th season was not amicable, and his subsequent relationship with the show, in which he continued to receive creator royalties while having no involvement in the production, was a source of occasional public tension. Simon became known in his later years for his philanthropy, directing substantial portions of his royalty income toward animal rescue organizations and other charitable causes before his death in 2015 from colon cancer. His contribution to what the show became in its foundational years has been consistently acknowledged by those who understand how much of what made it great was built in seasons 1 through 4. Fact 148. The contract negotiations that produced the $360,000 per episode deal for the main cast in the early 2000s became public in ways that gave external audiences an unusual view into the financial structure of a major television production. The negotiation involved a period of genuine uncertainty during which the cast collectively threatened to walk away from the show. The studio reportedly considered, seriously enough to investigate practically, the possibility of recasting the main voice roles. This prospect, which would have fundamentally altered the show in ways that most observers believed would have been both commercially and creatively disastrous, was the cast's most powerful negotiating position. They were right to use it. The deal that was eventually reached reflected a studio acknowledgement that the show was simply not viable without its specific cast, and that the cost of that specificity was worth paying. Fact 149. Harry Shearer's public announcement in 2015 that he would not return for season 27 was unusual in its visibility for what are typically private contractual negotiations. Most contract disputes in long-running shows are resolved in private, with the public aware only of the outcomes. Shearer's decision to announce his departure through social media made the negotiation itself a public event, creating pressure on the production in ways that a private withdrawal would not have generated. The episode that aired during the period of uncertainty, written to minimize dialogue given to Shearer's characters without making their minimal presence a story element, stands in the catalog as a document of a moment when the show came genuinely close to losing one of its most essential and most irreplaceable contributors. Fact 150. The show's satire of Fox News and of the corporate structure that owns both Fox News and the Fox broadcast network on which The Simpsons airs represents one of the more unusual creative arrangements in American broadcasting history. The show has produced extensive satirical commentary on Fox News across its run, depicting the network in terms that its subjects would find unflattering. This commentary has aired on Fox with the knowledge and consent of the corporate parent. The arrangement has survived because the show's commercial value to the corporation has consistently outweighed whatever discomfort the satire causes. Al Jean and others have spoken about this arrangement with dry humor that acknowledges its strange quality. The show bites the hand that feeds it. The hand keeps feeding it. The commercial logic that makes this possible is itself a form of the show's commentary on how commercial logic works. Fact 151. The episode Homer's Enemy, which aired in Season 8, generated a genuine creative argument within the writing room that has been documented by multiple participants, and that reflects a real disagreement about what the show's social contract with its audience required. The episode introduced Frank Grimes, a competent and hardworking man who is systematically destroyed by his encounter with a world in which Homer succeeds despite his obvious and thorough incompetence. The creative argument was about whether the episode was honest or cruel, whether it was the most truthful thing the show had ever done, or whether it violated the implicit promise the show had made to its audience about the nature of Homer's world. The episode aired. Both positions continue to be held by people who have discussed it across the years since. The argument itself has never fully resolved, which is perhaps the most accurate measure of how genuinely difficult the creative question was. Fact 152. The departure of showrunner Mike Scully after Season 11 was followed by a period in the show's critical reception that many observers have identified as the beginning of its most divisive era. Scully's tenure produced episodes that were more physically absurd and less rooted in character logic than the classic seasons, a shift that was deliberate rather than accidental. Scully has been frank in interviews about the directions he was trying to take the show during his tenure and about the mixed reception those directions received. The debate about when the show changed and whether those changes constituted a genuine creative decline is one of the most persistent arguments in discussions of the show's long history, and it cannot be fully resolved because it depends on what you believe the show's primary obligation to its audience is. Fact 153. The writing room has experienced significant turnover across the show's history, with individual writers typically staying for a relatively small number of seasons before moving on to other projects. The exceptions, the writers who stayed for extended periods and became part of the show's institutional memory, are notable for what their sustained presence contributed to the show's creative consistency. The challenge for any long-running show is that its best writers are often its most marketable writers, and the marketability the show helped create is also the thing that eventually attracts those writers to other opportunities. The show has managed this tension across 36 years with varying degrees of success. Fact 154. John Swartzwelder's departure from the show following Season 13 and his subsequent nearly complete disappearance from public professional life was not accompanied by any public statement or explanation. He simply stopped working on the show and stopped being visible in any professional context. His colleagues have been respectful of his evident desire for privacy in discussing the departure, describing it in terms that emphasize his personal choices without speculating about the specific circumstances that led to them. The self-published comic novels he has begun releasing in recent years have been warmly received by fans who recognized his specific voice and sensibility immediately, and they have served as the primary evidence available that he remains creatively active. Fact 155. The show's legal department has been continuously busy across its entire run, managing a steady stream of intellectual property questions, clearance requirements, and concerns about specific depictions of real people and institutions. A satirical production that references real people, real corporations, and real cultural products in essentially every episode generates a substantial and continuous legal workload. Some of the show's most celebrated jokes required extensive legal review before airing. In several cases, specific jokes were modified based on legal guidance rather than creative preference. The legal layer of the show's production is entirely invisible to audiences, but has shaped the final product in ways that are occasionally significant. Fact 156. The show's relationship with its own critics, both professional and fan-based, has been one of the more unusual aspects of its cultural life across its history. The show has been analyzed, praised, criticized, mourned, and defended across its entire run, and the people making it have been aware of and occasionally responsive to that critical discourse in ways that have sometimes fed back into the work. The show has made jokes about its own critical reputation, about the argument over when it peaked, about the specific expectations that long-term fans bring to new episodes. This self-awareness of its own critical life is one of the stranger aspects of a show that has been running long enough to have developed a sustained relationship with its own legacy while still actively producing new work. Fact 157. The show's relationship with Fox's Broadcast Standards Department has been, by various accounts, a productive creative tension over the decades, rather than a straightforwardly adversarial relationship. The writers have consistently pushed against the limits of what broadcast standards would permit, and the network's standards department has pushed back, and the results of these negotiations have shaped the specific form of the show's comedy in ways that are invisible in the final product, but that were live creative questions during production. Several of the show's most celebrated jokes exist in precisely the form they do because they were the version of the joke that successfully navigated the negotiation between what the writers wanted and what broadcast standards would allow. Fact 158. Several writers have left the show in circumstances that were contentious enough to generate industry discussion without being specific enough to be fully understood from outside the production. The writing room of any long-running show accumulates internal history, preferences, alliances, and tensions that are invisible to audiences. The Simpsons, which has operated for long enough to be an institution rather than simply a show, has all of this and more. The dynamics of the room have changed with each major transition in the writing staff, and those changes have registered in the work even when they have not been publicly documented or acknowledged. Fact 159. Al Jean has spoken in interviews about the experience of leading a production he joined as a young writer, and that he has now been associated with across the majority of his professional life. He has described the relationship between his own creative identity and the show's identity as deeply entangled in ways that are sometimes difficult to fully articulate from inside. He is both the steward of a voice he helped build in the show's early seasons, and a person whose own creative voice has been shaped by decades of that stewardship. The two things are not fully separable at this point. The show and the person who leads it have grown around each other across 30-plus years. Fact 160. The show has managed the challenge of maintaining institutional creative memory across multiple generations of writing staff by developing a specific set of practices and reference materials for onboarding new writers. New writers on The Simpsons are expected to watch a substantial body of earlier episodes before contributing to the room. They are given context about the show's creative history and about the specific standards and sensibilities that defined its best periods. Whether this institutional transmission of creative values successfully preserves what made those earlier periods distinctive, or whether it merely transmits a description of those values without transmitting the specific human genius that produced them, is one of the more genuinely unresolvable questions in discussions of the show's long history. Number. Section 10. The deepest lore, characters, callbacks, and hidden canon. Fact 161. The character of Lenny Leonard and Carl Carlson, Homer's two closest friends and co-workers at the Springfield nuclear power plant, have a relationship that has been quietly developed across hundreds of episodes into something more specific and more textured than simple workplace friendship. Multiple episodes across different seasons have included moments, sometimes brief and easily overlooked, sometimes more explicit, that suggest a relationship between Lenny and Carl that carries emotional weight beyond professional camaraderie. The implication has been acknowledged in DVD commentaries and interviews by writers who worked on relevant episodes. It has been sustained with a consistency across different writing teams and different eras of production that suggests it represents a deliberate and maintained creative choice, rather than an accumulation of accidental moments. The decision to never address this directly within the show's fiction is itself a creative choice, one that keeps the relationship most powerful by leaving it in the space between what is shown and what is stated. Fact 162. The character of Ned Flanders was established early in the show's run as Homer's morally superior neighbor, a man who is in every measurable way more virtuous and admirable than Homer, and whose existence functions primarily in those early seasons as a comic source of Homer's resentment. The early Ned was defined almost entirely by his function in Homer's life. The decision to give Ned an independent interior life, to explore what his relentless niceness cost him and where it came from, was one of the most significant character developments in the show's middle period. The revelation in Season 9 that Ned's behavior was the result of childhood behavioral modification, that the aggression of the feral child he had been was reprogrammed rather than genuinely grown past, fundamentally recontextualized every Ned story that had preceded it. His patience with Homer was no longer simple virtue. It was pathology with a very specific origin. His faith was no longer simple belief. It was a coping structure built over a psychological wound. The discovery does not make him less admirable. It makes him more human, and significantly more complex. Fact 163. The character arc of Sideshow Bob across more than 30 years of recurring appearances is one of the most sustained single-character arcs in the history of television comedy. Bob began as a simple villain, a character defined by his thwarted theatrical ambitions and his irrational resentment of Krusty the Clown. Across subsequent appearances, he became something more layered, a character with a genuine interior life, specific aesthetic and intellectual commitments that go beyond villainy, a family whose specific dysfunction mirrors his own in ways the show has explored in a dedicated episode, and a relationship with Bart Simpson that is one of the show's most complicated and most genuinely funny ongoing dynamics. The joke of Sideshow Bob is that he is clearly capable of far greater things than murdering a 10-year-old boy, and that he has devoted decades of considerable intelligence and theatrical talent to the pursuit of a goal that is, in proportion to those gifts, almost insultingly small. The comedy of that gap has sustained itself across 30 years because Kelsey Grammer plays the grandeur with absolute sincerity, making the gap feel genuinely interesting rather than simply repetitive. Fact 164. The episode Lisa the Iconoclast, which aired in Season 7, is widely considered one of the most sophisticated pieces of writing the show produced in its classic period. The episode centers on Lisa's discovery that Jebediah Springfield, the founding father whose statue stands in the town square and whose legacy the community celebrates with an annual festival, was not the heroic figure of the official mythology, but a violent opportunist whose biography had been systematically falsified to create a more inspirational founding narrative. The episode's resolution is the most interesting part of the story. Lisa concludes, after considerable internal struggle, that the community's investment in the Jebediah myth is not simply delusion. The false story inspires real goodness in real people. The community that celebrates this myth is a better community for believing in it. Debunking the myth would destroy the inspiration without replacing it with anything functional. The truth in this case is less valuable than the useful fiction. It is a conclusion that is simultaneously cynical and genuinely humane, and it was written with enough moral ambiguity that thoughtful viewers have disagreed about whether Lisa made the right call. Fact 165. The relationship between Homer and his mother Mona, as established in the Season 7 episode Mother Simpson and revisited in subsequent appearances, is the show's most emotionally developed family relationship outside of Homer's immediate household. The episode revealed that Mona's absence from Homer's life was the direct consequence of Mr. Burns' identification of her as a radical activist who had destroyed his biological weapons facility. Burns reported her to the FBI. She lived as a fugitive for 27 years to protect her family. The revelation is devastating for multiple reasons, the most important of which is what it tells us about the architecture of Homer's emotional life. His desperate need for love and approval, his terror of abandonment, his willingness to endure almost anything rather than risk being left alone, all of these characteristics were formed in the absence of the mother he believed had chosen to leave. She had not chosen to leave. She had been taken from him by the same man who signed his paychecks. Homer is not capable, in the story, of fully processing this connection. His cognitive limitations prevent him from assembling the complete picture. The story makes this limitation genuinely tragic, rather than simply comedic. Fact 166. The character of groundskeeper Willie has developed, across the show's run, from a simple joke character defined primarily by his Scottish accent and his explosive temperament, into something with more internal consistency and more dignity. Willie's specific worldview, his combination of genuine physical competence with emotional volatility, his position in the Springfield community as someone who performs essential labor while being chronically undervalued by the institution he maintains, is one of the show's most consistent observations about the experience of working people in institutional environments. He keeps Springfield Elementary functional. He maintains the building. He performs the physical labor that makes the educational environment possible. He is paid poorly and treated as invisible by the institution's leadership. The show has maintained both registers of his character across hundreds of appearances, with more care than a casual description of him as a comedy background character would suggest. Fact 167. The show's portrayal of the Bart-Lisa sibling dynamic has been one of its most consistently rewarding long-form character relationships. The two characters are in almost every significant way different from each other. Bart is impulsive, socially skilled, academically indifferent, comfortable in his own skin in a way that has nothing to do with being good at anything the school recognizes as valuable. Lisa is cerebral, earnest, academically exceptional, and socially isolated in the specific way of children whose competencies the people around them cannot match and therefore cannot fully affirm. Despite these differences, or because of them, the relationship between the two characters has genuine warmth and genuine complexity. They need each other in ways neither fully acknowledges. Bart benefits from Lisa's moral seriousness, even when he resists it most actively. Lisa benefits from Bart's freedom, even when she most strongly disapproves of how he uses it. The episodes that have explored their relationship directly are consistently among the show's most emotionally rich. Fact 168. Marge Simpson's interior life, which the show has explored with increasing depth across different periods of its history, is one of its most significant contributions to the representation of the American domestic experience in popular entertainment. Marge is often described in summary as simply the patient, long-suffering wife and mother who maintains stability while the more chaotic personalities around her create disorder. This description is accurate as far as it goes and completely insufficient as a characterization of the full person the show has developed across 3 decades. Marge has ambitions of her own, artistic and professional and personal, that the show has periodically acknowledged and explored. The episodes that have examined what Marge might become if given the freedom to fully become it are among the show's most interesting because they complicate the summary version of the character in ways that make her feel genuinely human rather than simply functional within the family structure. She is patient because she has made specific choices about what she values most, not because she lacks desires of her own. Those choices have real costs, and the show has occasionally been willing to examine those costs directly. Fact 169. The character of Chief Clancy Wiggum, Springfield's perpetually incompetent police chief, functions as the show's ongoing observation on the relationship between institutional authority and actual effectiveness. Wiggum has all the markers of authority: the badge, the title, the official capacity to maintain order. He has essentially none of the competencies that authority is supposed to represent. He is slow, easily distracted, compromised by personal relationships, and consistently unable to accomplish anything that requires meaningful professional skill. What makes Wiggum more interesting than a simple incompetence joke is that the show has also given him genuine humanity. He loves his son Ralph with a completeness that the show does not undercut with irony. He is aware, at some level, of his own limitations, even if that awareness does not translate into measurable improvement. He has moments of real dignity. He is a portrait of institutional failure that maintains its humanity, which is a more honest portrait of how institutional failure usually works than most dramatic television provides. Fact 170. The episode in which Homer's intelligence is temporarily restored following the removal of the crayon from his brain, which aired in Season 12, is one of the show's most philosophically interesting single stories. The premise that Homer's chronic cognitive limitation is the result of a physical obstruction rather than simply a fixed characteristic of his biology opens the question of who Homer would be without that limitation. The episode's answer is specific and genuinely interesting. Homer at full intelligence is a person who sees the world clearly enough that what he sees is unbearable. He sees his job for what it is. He sees his marriage for what it is. He sees Springfield for what it is. He sees all of this with a clarity. The clouded version of himself is protected from. The clarity is worse than the fog, so he chooses the fog. He has the crayon replaced. He chooses cognitive limitation because the alternative is an intelligence that cannot make peace with the life it inhabits. The show presents this choice without moralizing around it, and the refusal to moralize is what makes the episode genuinely profound. Fact 171. The recurring character of Hans Moleman, the elderly near-blind man who appears throughout the show's background and who has been killed more times than any other character in the show's history, represents a specific comedic principle that the show has pursued across 3 decades. Molleman dies in regular canonical episodes and returns in subsequent ones without explanation. He has been crushed, run over, buried, incinerated, and subjected to various other fates across hundreds of episodes. The joke is not simply the repetition of his death. It is the combination of his apparent frailty and his inexhaustible recurrence, the gap between how permanently mortal he looks and how temporarily mortal he actually is within the show's logic. He is the show's most honest and most open acknowledgement of its own cartoon logic, wearing that acknowledgement openly and making it a joke rather than a weakness. He also once stated his age as 31 years old. Look at him, and consider what that implies. Fact 172. The show's treatment of Springfield's economy and of Homer's specific economic anxieties has been one of its most consistent and most resonant satirical subjects across its entire run. Homer's position at the nuclear plant, his salary, his mortgage, his recurring near disasters with the family finances, his occasional entrepreneurial ventures and their reliable failures, his fundamental condition as a man who is always approximately one unexpected expense away from genuine crisis, all of these elements together constitute a detailed and accurate portrait of the American working-class economic experience across the show's active decades. The comedy of financial precarity is real, and it is funny in the way that things genuinely stressful are sometimes funny when they are recognized and named precisely. But the show has never allowed the comedy to fully obscure the stress. Homer's fear of losing his job, his fear of failing to provide for his family, his terror of a specific kind of failure that would leave Marge and the children without security, these are emotional realities. The show returns to consistently enough that they constitute a sustained portrait as well as a recurring joke. Fact 173. The character of Mr. Burns has been developed, across 36 years, into something more dimensionally interesting than a simple corporate villain. Burns began as a representation of unchecked power, a figure defined by his wealth, his cruelty, and his complete indifference to consequences. These qualities have remained consistent, but the show has also developed Burns as a character with specific history, specific relationships, and specific vulnerabilities that his wealth and power have not entirely eliminated. His relationship with Smithers, which functions as the show's most elaborate depiction of an asymmetrical emotional bond, has accumulated across hundreds of episodes into something genuinely complex. Smithers' devotion to Burns is total, and it is not reducible to the devotion of an employee to an employer. It is the devotion of a person who has organized his entire identity around another person, who manages the weekly medical treatments that keep Burns alive, and who would be both personally devastated and professionally purposeless if Burns ceased to need him. The relationship is the show's most sustained exploration of how love and power and dependency entangle with each other in ways that cannot be fully separated. Fact 174. The show's portrayal of Homer and Marge's marriage, across 36 years and hundreds of episodes, contains more genuine romantic writing than most programs that are explicitly romantic dramas. The show has depicted the full range of a long marriage: early passion, comfortable familiarity, the erosion of attention, the crisis of connection, and the renewal of love that follows genuine difficulty. Several episodes structured around the question of whether Homer and Marge will stay together have been among the show's most emotionally effective. The audience's certainty that they will always be together, a certainty the show has occasionally exploited by making it seem genuinely uncertain, is itself a form of deep emotional investment that 36 years of watching the same couple navigate the same fundamental challenges has only deepened. The marriage works on screen because the show treats it as something worth taking seriously. Fact 175. The show has been building, across its entire run, a portrait of the American middle class that is more detailed and more honest than almost anything produced in another narrative form during the same period. Homer is not the ideal worker, but he is the actual worker, the person who shows up and does enough and goes home to a family he loves without fully understanding. Marge is not the ideal partner, but she is the actual partner of a complicated person, holding a complicated household together with patience that has real limits she reaches and recovers from. Bart is not the ideal child, but he is the actual difficult child, alive with intelligence that has no legitimate channel and finding illegitimate ones instead. Lisa is not the ideal daughter, but she is the actual girl who is too smart for her circumstances and must live in them anyway. The portrait is imperfect. It is also persistently and stubbornly true. The show knows these people. It has known them for a very long time. Fact 176. The show is, at its deepest level, a story about a family that loves each other. This is the fact that all of the satire and all of the darkness and all of the social criticism rests on. The show works because the Simpson family is real. Not realistic, the show has never been interested in realism. But real in the sense of being emotionally true, in the sense that the love between Homer and Marge is a genuine portrayal of what love between complicated and imperfect people actually looks and feels like over time. The love between Homer and his children is specific and detailed enough to be genuinely moving even inside a cartoon frame. The love between Marge and her children is the structural foundation of everything the show has built over 36 years. Every satirical observation the show makes about American society, every dark joke about institutional failure and environmental poisoning and economic precarity and political corruption, is made from inside a family that functions, not perfectly, not without conflict, not without the ordinary human failures that accumulate in any long-term human relationship, but together, the Simpsons stay together. And that staying together is the show's ultimate argument about what matters. Fact 177. After 36 years, 788 episodes, one theatrical feature film, dozens of Emmy Awards, a Peabody Award, a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, an entry in the Oxford English Dictionary, theme park attractions on multiple continents, academic papers across more disciplines than can be quickly counted, a television theme that is performed in concert halls, a complete portrait of the American domestic experience that has proven more enduringly accurate than almost anything produced alongside it. After all of that, The Simpsons is still on the air. There is no announced end date. The show continues one episode at a time every season, and the question this fact raises is not how or why the show has lasted this long, though those are interesting questions. The question it raises is what it means that we keep watching. That, after 36 years, after nearly 800 episodes we could watch anytime we wanted through the complete archive now available everywhere, we still turn on the new episodes. We still find out what Springfield is doing this week. Maybe it is because the show gives us something nothing else gives us in quite the same way. A family that never changes in a world that changes constantly. A fixed point in the cultural landscape we can return to and find intact. A place where the children are always young, and the parents are always together, and the town always survives, and the credits always roll, and everything always resets. Springfield is ours. We built it. We have been maintaining it together for 36 years. And as long as we keep watching, it will keep being there. Number outro. And that is all 177 of them. Every one true. Every one a small room to rest in for a moment before the next one. If some of them put you to sleep, then the script did exactly what it was supposed to do. If some of them kept you awake, following one thread into another, remembering an episode or a moment or a specific joke that this brought back, then that is what Springfield does. It holds you in ways you do not expect, for longer than you plan to stay. Springfield will be there when you wake up. It always is. That is the whole point. On the nuclear power plant extended, the Springfield nuclear power plant is, within the internal logic of the show, the most important building in the history of American fictional architecture. Not because it is grand, though it dominates the town's skyline with the particular kind of dominance that industrial facilities impose on the landscapes around them, those cooling towers visible from almost any exterior shot of Springfield. It is the most important building because it is the cause. Every fact about Springfield that does not make immediate sense, every physical characteristic of the residents that deviates from normal human biology, every pattern of behavior that suggests something systematic has gone wrong in this community can be traced, if you follow the threads carefully enough, back to that facility. The show established this gradually rather than stating it outright, which is one of the things that makes it so interesting as a piece of sustained storytelling. The three-eyed fish appears in Season 2 and is treated as a local news story, a curiosity, something to be investigated and then filed away. The fact that fish caught near a nuclear power plant with a known history of safety violations have grown a third eye is presented to the characters of Springfield as alarming and is then allowed to fade from the story without consequence. Nobody follows up. Nobody studies the water. Nobody asks what the third eye means for the people who have been drinking the same water the fish have been living in. The answer has been visible in every establishing shot of the Simpson family since the first episode, the yellow skin that defines every Springfield resident, the specific physical characteristics that make the show's characters look the way they look. These were explained to audiences as simply the art style, as the visual language of the show, as the way animation works. But within the fiction of the show's world, within the logic of a universe in which Burns's plant exists and has been leaking into the local water supply for decades, there is another explanation available. The art style is the mutation. The visual language of the show is the document of what chronic environmental contamination looks like when it has been running long enough to define an entire community's physical characteristics. Burns knows this. The show has made his knowledge explicit across multiple episodes. He undergoes weekly medical treatments so intensive that they cause his body to emit visible radiation. He has personal physicians. He funds private medical research. He has, within the show's universe, a pharmaceutical infrastructure capable of synthesizing experimental treatments that do not exist in conventional medicine. He understands radiation because radiation is what keeps him alive. And he understands what his plant is doing to Springfield, because the same understanding that helps him manage his own exposure informs his observation of what unmanaged exposure does to everyone else in the community. Homer's continued employment at the plant, despite the 342 safety violations documented in the show's most specific accounting of the facility's failures, is not negligence on Burns's part. Homer is not employed because Burns is careless. He is employed because he is useful. A competent safety inspector would identify the violations, report them, and either force the plant to correct them or force its closure. Homer ensures that the violations continue. The radiation keeps leaking. The water stays contaminated. And Burns maintains his monopoly over the town's power supply and, by extension, over its economy and its population's cognitive capacity. The genius of the radiation theory, if you want to call it that, is that it makes the show's most celebrated visual quirks into evidence of something genuinely troubling. The 4 fingers that every Springfield resident has instead of 5. The specific shape of the overbite that Homer and many of his neighbors share. The hair that maintains its shape without product, that grows in patterns no human hair grows in, that stays geometrically perfect across decades without appearing to be cut. These are the things we learn to see as simply the way The Simpsons looks. They are also, within the show's own fiction, the things that distinguish Springfield residents from people who live outside the contamination zone. The visitors who come to Springfield look different. Their proportions are more naturalistic. Their features more closely approximate actual human anatomy. The show draws outsiders with different rules than it draws insiders, and the difference is consistent enough to constitute an argument about what Springfield has done to the people who live there. On the coma theory extended, the specific moment that the coma theory identifies as the pivot point of the show's entire history is the 18th episode of the 4th season, which aired on April 1st of 1993. The episode is called So It's Come to This, a Simpsons clip show. The premise is unremarkable by the show's standards. Bart escalates his April Fool's pranks until one of them sends Homer to the hospital. While he is recovering in his hospital bed, a vending machine tips over and lands on him, putting him into a genuine coma. He flatlines. The episode ends with Homer appearing to wake up, embracing his family, and immediately strangling Bart. The family laughs. The episode ends. The show continues. But before the episode ends, it includes a detail that the coma theory treats as the most significant piece of information in the show's entire run. The doctor informs Homer, upon his apparent awakening, that he has lost 5% of his brain function as a permanent result of the coma. 5%, gone, destroyed, never returning. And Homer's response to learning that he has been permanently brain damaged is to laugh, even though he says he does not understand why he is laughing. The family finds this charming rather than alarming. The episode ends. 32 more seasons follow. The coma theory argues that those 32 seasons did not happen to Homer the way we understand things to happen to people who are awake. They happen to Homer the way things happen in the mind of a man who is unconscious. They are a dream. Every escalating absurdity of the show's post-season 4 period, everything that has made casual fans say that the show changed, that it stopped being the realistic domestic comedy it was in its first 4 seasons and became something more surreal and more operatic and more disconnected from the grounded family life that defined its beginning. All of that is the dream of a man whose brain is slowly failing, generating a simulation of his family and his life using the only reference material it has access to. The aging problem, which is the most discussed formal peculiarity of the show, is the detail the coma theory handles most elegantly. Nobody in Springfield ages because the man dreaming Springfield cannot imagine them aging. He went into the coma when his children were specific ages, when his wife looked a specific way, when his house had a specific character. The dream preserves all of that exactly. Of course Bart is still 10. Of course Lisa is still 8. Of course Marge still looks the way she looked on the day the vending machine fell. Homer's unconscious mind cannot give them years he was not present to witness. It can only give them back the versions of themselves that existed the last time he saw them clearly. The celebrity appearances that flood the show's later seasons also make sense under this framework, in a way they do not under any other explanatory model. Homer is lying in a hospital room. Ambient sound enters his consciousness from the television in the room, from conversations at his bedside, from whatever media is audible through the fog of unconsciousness. His brain processes these fragments and incorporates them into the dream. The names and voices he hears become characters in Springfield. That is why later seasons are saturated with famous people in ways the earlier seasons were not. It is not that Springfield became a magnet for celebrities. It is that Homer's dreaming mind, absorbing ambient media from the world outside his hospital room, began incorporating more of it into the dream as the years passed, and more names and voices accumulated in the background of his perception. The show acknowledged this theory in season 34 in a way that was characteristic of how it handles its own mythology, with simultaneous affirmation and denial, showing you the truth and then insisting it was not true. A fake deleted scene was released in which Homer wakes from a long coma, revealing that every outlandish episode had been a dream. It was presented as material leaked by hackers, then disavowed by the production. The show animated Homer waking up from a coma and then said it was a hoax, which is exactly the kind of gesture a show would make if it wanted to acknowledge that a theory was correct while maintaining plausible deniability about that acknowledgement. On the Who Shot Mr. Burns mystery extended, the mystery of who shot Mr. Burns is the most formally ambitious single story in the show's history. Nothing else the show has attempted across its 36 years required the same combination of sustained narrative commitment, audience engagement, and creative resolution under genuine public scrutiny. The mystery was built to be solved by the audience. The promotion around it explicitly invited viewers to participate, to examine the evidence presented in Part 1 and arrive at a conclusion before Part 2 revealed the answer. A national contest was held. Fox promoted the mystery as a genuine cultural event. America's Most Wanted produced a tie-in special treating the fictional crime as a real, unsolved case. The evidence the show presented in Part 1 was designed to be solvable. The creative team built the mystery with the intention that a careful viewer who paid close attention to the details of the episode would be able to identify the shooter before the answer was revealed. The sundial scene, in which Burns collapses and his hands fall on specific letters of the dial, was the central clue. His position on the dial pointed to the letters W and S, or from Burns's own perspective to M and S, which the answer episode would decode as Maggie Simpson. The problem is that Burns himself explicitly stated in the answer episode that his hands pointing at those letters was not intentional. He did not position himself deliberately to spell out his attacker's initials. He simply fell. The central clue of the mystery was described by the victim himself as a coincidence. The evidence around which the entire national puzzle was organized was, by the account of the person it was supposed to come from, meaningless. This detail is not a small inconsistency. It is the mystery's central clue publicly disowned by its own source. Then there is Homer's confession in Season 18. He says, in what the show presents as a throwaway line, that he was the one who shot Burns. Nobody investigates. Nobody reopens the case. Homer confesses to the attempted murder of the wealthiest man in Springfield, and the show treats it as something the audience is expected to process as a joke and move past. Either Homer is lying for reasons the show does not elaborate, which is entirely consistent with his character, or the original verdict was wrong, and Homer knows it is wrong because he is the one who pulled the trigger. And if Homer did it, then the investigation that followed Burns's shooting, the investigation that ultimately pointed to Maggie, was a failure of justice that the show has been allowing to stand as settled history for nearly 3 decades. The alternate endings that were fully produced and animated before the decision to go with Maggie was made demonstrate that the writers themselves were not certain. a complete Smithers ending exists. A complete ending with Barney as the shooter was developed in an early draft phase. The mystery's answer was not determined by the clues. The clues were adjusted to accommodate whatever answer the writers eventually chose. And the answer they chose, a baby who cannot be prosecuted and who cannot deny the accusation, is the answer that most efficiently closes the case without actually resolving any of the dramatic tension the mystery generated. On Maggie Simpson, Extended. Maggie Simpson has been 1 year old for 36 years, which means she has been watching her family from the vantage point of infancy for longer than most of the people watching the show have been alive. She has watched Homer fail and recover and fail again. She has watched Marge hold the household together with the focused patience of someone who has learned to see crises coming and position herself between them and the people she loves before they arrive. She has watched Bart perform mischief with an energy that the household contains but never quite channels into anything useful. She has watched Lisa speak truth to every available power and receive nothing but resistance in return, and she has said almost nothing. Her first word, Daddy, happened once in a Season 3 episode, voiced by Elizabeth Taylor, and was never repeated. 32 seasons of subsequent production have passed without Maggie developing language in any meaningful way. She is surrounded by a family of extremely verbal people in a household that generates near-constant noise. Homer never stops talking. Marge never stops worrying out loud. Bart never stops provoking. Lisa never stops lecturing. The Simpson home is a wall of speech, and in the middle of it, Maggie sits and watches and processes and says nothing. The theory that her silence is strategic rather than developmental is supported by more than just the circumstantial evidence of her intelligence. The final shot of the Who Shot Mr. Burns resolution, in which Maggie alone in a room checks carefully to confirm that nobody is watching her before mimicking the act of firing a gun, is a sequence that requires a specific set of behaviors to read the way it reads. It requires her to check her surroundings deliberately. It requires her to recognize that the gesture would be significant if observed. It requires her to wait for the room to be empty before performing it. These are not behaviors associated with infants. They are behaviors associated with someone who understands what they have done and has calculated that performing this gesture privately, in the absence of witnesses, is the correct choice. The Longest Daycare, the short theatrical film released in 2012, is the most sustained and most unambiguous depiction of Maggie's actual cognitive level. Over 7 minutes, without a single word of spoken language, Maggie navigates a hostile institutional environment, identifies a vulnerable creature that needs protection, develops a strategy for protecting it, and executes that strategy against multiple obstacles, including a physically larger and more aggressive peer and an institutional structure that imposes rules she neither respects nor is ultimately constrained by. Her decision-making throughout the film is not the decision-making of an infant. It is the decision-making of someone operating with complete situational awareness, genuine strategic planning, and the ability to improvise when initial plans encounter obstacles. She succeeds. She releases the butterfly. She returns to baseline, appearing to everyone around her to be exactly what they expect a baby to be. That is Maggie's gift and Maggie's strategy. She appears to be exactly what everyone expects a baby to be. She is none of those things. She is the opposite of those things, and she has been maintaining that disguise, with complete success for 36 years. On the Floating Timeline Extended, the floating timeline of The Simpsons, in which the present is always the viewer's present and the characters never age, creates a specific kind of temporal impossibility that becomes more visible and more strange the longer the show runs. Bart Simpson was 10 years old in December of 1989. He is 10 years old in 2025. In the real world, a child who was 10 in 1989 would now be 45 or 46 years old. Bart has been 10 for the entirety of that person's adult life. He was 10 when that person voted for the first time. He was 10 when that person got married or had children. He was 10 when that person's parents aged and perhaps died. The contrast between the real-world experience of time and the Springfield experience of time becomes more acute with each passing year. The backstory problem is the most visible structural consequence of the floating timeline. When the show began, Homer and Marge's history was grounded in a specific era. They met in high school in the late 1970s. The music, the fashion, the cultural references of their courtship and early marriage were of that period. Homer's early memories included things that happened in the 1960s. His relationship to the specific history of the second half of the 20th century was legible as the relationship of a man who had lived through it. But as the floating timeline moved the show's present forward year by year, the backstory had to move with it. If Homer and Marge are in their mid-30s in 2025, they did not meet in the late 1970s. They met in approximately 2005. Their high school experience was not defined by Vietnam and Watergate and disco. It was defined by MySpace and early YouTube and the Iraq War. The show has depicted this shift explicitly in flashback episodes that have rewritten the characters' formative years in different decades depending on when the flashback was produced. Homer and Marge have been grunge fans and hipsters and millennials. Their origin story is a document that gets revised approximately every decade to maintain temporal plausibility in the present while acknowledging that the present keeps moving. The coma theory handles this problem cleanly. If Homer is dreaming, his unconscious mind does not have access to a consistent calendar. It does not have access to the specific years and dates that would pin the backstory to a fixed timeline. It has impressions. It has feelings. It has a general sense that his history with Marge was romantic and formative, and that it happened before the children were born. The specific decade keeps shifting because a dreaming mind organizes memory by emotional significance rather than by chronological sequence, and the emotional significance of Homer meeting Marge does not require a specific year to be vivid and real. The radiation theory handles it differently. If the biological processes of Springfield's residents have been fundamentally altered by decades of nuclear exposure, then normal aging may simply not apply to them. The mutation that gave Homer his absurd healing capacity and his near indestructibility might also have altered the cellular processes that cause the body to age over time. The children are not aging because their biology, warped by the same environment that warped everything else in Springfield, no longer ages on the normal human schedule. The town has been frozen not just in its memory but in its cells. The show has, across its history, acknowledged that the floating timeline creates genuine absurdities. It has made these absurdities jokes rather than allowing them to simply be inconsistencies. Homer's backstory changes, and the show nods at the change. Characters' ages are sometimes referenced in ways that contradict what earlier episodes established, and the contradiction is acknowledged or ignored depending on whether acknowledging it is funnier than ignoring it. The show has turned its own structural peculiarity into a feature of its comedy, which is one of the more graceful solutions to an inherently unsolvable problem. On Springfield's location extended, the question of where Springfield is located is the show's longest-running and most deliberately sustained mystery, and it is different in character from the show's other mysteries. The Who Shot Mr. Burns mystery had a definitive answer, even if the evidence for that answer is disputable. The radiation theory has a definitive argument, even if the show never formally endorses it. But the question of Springfield's geographic location has no answer that the show will allow to remain unchallenged. Every piece of evidence that appears to narrow the field is contradicted by a subsequent episode. Springfield is in the north, then in the south. It borders states that cannot actually be adjacent to each other. It has oceanfront property and mountain ranges and deserts within what appears to be driving distance of each other. It has weather patterns that are geographically inconsistent with any single American region. The town's area code, the abbreviation on its license plates, the distance from its nearest neighbor, all of these details have been established and then contradicted across different episodes without ever settling into a coherent geographic identity. Matt Groening's confirmation in 2012 that he named the town after Springfield, Oregon, was treated briefly as a resolution. Springfield is in Oregon. Case closed. And then the show continued producing episodes that were geographically inconsistent with Oregon, and the contradiction was simply allowed to exist alongside the confirmation. Groening's answer was accurate about the name's origin, and irrelevant to the question of where the fictional Springfield actually is, because the fictional Springfield does not have a definitive geographic location. It cannot have one. Its geographic impossibility is the point. The production philosophy behind this choice is straightforward and has been stated clearly by the show's creators. Springfield is meant to be everywhere. It is meant to feel familiar to viewers regardless of where they actually live. A town with a fixed location would be a specific place. Springfield is meant to be a universal place, the American town that is recognizable to people who grew up in Maine and people who grew up in California and people who grew up in Texas. The geographic impossibility is the mechanism by which the show achieves that universality. Springfield cannot be located because Springfield is meant to belong to everyone. Under the radiation theory, the geographic impossibility takes on a different character. If the contamination at the nuclear plant has altered the biology of everything in Springfield, why should the surrounding geography be exempt? If living organisms near the plant have developed characteristics that do not occur in normal biological populations, perhaps the land itself has been affected in ways that remove it from normal geographic constraints. Perhaps Springfield occupies a space that is physically impossible by the standards of the surrounding world, a bubble of altered reality sustained by decades of nuclear exposure. Under the coma theory, the geographic impossibility is even simpler to explain. Homer's dreaming mind does not have a precise internal map of American geography. It has impressions and fragments from every television show he ever watched, every vacation he ever took, every road trip he ever drove, every landscape he ever saw. The Springfield in his dream is assembled from all of those fragments without regard for geographic coherence, because a dreaming mind does not organize space the way a waking mind does. Space in a dream is organized by emotional logic rather than by cartographic accuracy, and Springfield feels like the right place because Homer's brain constructed it from everything that felt most like home. On Ned Flanders Extended. Ned Flanders is the character the show has quietly destroyed most thoroughly, and the destruction is so complete and so sustained that it has become its own form of portrait. Ned begins as the foil, the neighbor whose virtue makes Homer's deficits more visible by contrast. He is kind, disciplined, financially responsible, physically fit, a devoted father, and a good neighbor. He is by every measurable standard a better person than Homer in every way. And the show punishes him for it with a relentlessness that accumulates over 36 years into something genuinely dark. His wife Maud was killed by a t-shirt cannon fired from a grandstand at a racing event. The t-shirt cannon was being dodged by Homer at the time. Homer's reflexive self-preservation led directly to Maud's death. Ned forgave him. He absorbed this loss, the death of his wife, caused directly by his neighbor's self-interest, and responded with the grace his programming demands he express. He processed it through his faith. He moved forward. He did not permit himself to blame Homer in any lasting or actionable way, because his behavioral modification does not allow him to sustain that kind of anger. The revelation of the behavioral modification, which appears in the Season 8 episode Hurricane Nettie, recontextualizes every Ned story that precedes it. When Ned's house is destroyed by a hurricane and the town rebuilds it so poorly that it collapses immediately, Ned has a breakdown. He screams at the town. He names every person who has wronged him. He says things he has been suppressing for years. And then he is institutionalized, and in the facility it is revealed that his relentless niceness is not a natural character trait. It is the result of intensive childhood behavioral modification that suppressed an aggressive and uncontrollable temperament. His parents, beatniks who did not believe in discipline, took him to a psychiatrist who spent years conditioning the aggression out of him. The kindness is a cage built around a feral child by a professional who literally reprogrammed the child's emotional responses. This knowledge does not make Ned less admirable. He is still the person who chooses, every day, to behave with decency and grace toward people who do not always deserve it. But it changes the nature of what his character means. His patience with Homer is no longer saintly. It is pathological. He literally cannot sustain anger in the way a person who had not been behaviorally modified can sustain anger. His forgiveness is not a gift he freely chooses to offer. It is the only response his brain is capable of producing in circumstances that would drive a normally constituted person to lasting resentment. His goodness is real and also not entirely his own. The most quietly devastating fact about Ned in the show's theology is the one that the show states only by implication, through the specific detail of who God speaks to in Springfield. God has appeared to Homer multiple times. God has had conversations with Homer, offered Homer guidance, engaged with Homer as a person worthy of direct divine communication. God has never spoken to Ned, the devout man who goes to church every Sunday, who has organized his entire life around his faith, who has endured extraordinary losses and responded to them with the patience and grace his faith demands, has never received the direct communication that Homer stumbles into. The drunk who falls asleep in church gets divine conversation. The man who has dedicated his life to faith gets silence. This is not random. The show is making a specific argument about the relationship between piety and divine favor, about whether goodness in a particular system is rewarded by that system's governing principles. And the argument it makes is not a comfortable one. In Springfield, the system does not reward goodness. It rewards compliance. And Ned is the most thoroughly compliant person in the town. The one whose compliance was engineered into him before he was old enough to choose it, and his reward is a dead wife and a destroyed house and a neighbor who will never truly appreciate him and a God who finds Homer Simpson more interesting to talk to. On Burns's Immortality Extended, the question of how Mr. Burns is still alive is one of the show's most interesting internal mysteries, and the answer the show provides, buried across multiple episodes without ever being assembled into a single explicit statement, is more interesting than the mystery it answers. Burns is not simply old. He is impossibly old by the standards of any biological system functioning under normal conditions. His birth has been placed across different episodes. At various points in the late 19th century, he has described personal experiences of events that happened before most of his current employees' grandparents were born. The most conservative reading of his established timeline places his age at well over 100. The more expansive reading suggests something closer to 140. He functions. That is the remarkable thing. He is frail. His physical strength is essentially non-existent, to the point where a small child can overpower him in a direct confrontation. But his mind is sharp. His strategic thinking is intact. His grasp of modern finance, modern technology, and modern political manipulation is current and effective. He is running a functioning corporation. He is exercising political influence over a municipal government. He is doing all of this while being, by any biological standard, impossibly old. The show provides the mechanism of his survival in the Springfield Files episode, in which Burns is revealed as the glowing alien Homer encountered in the woods near the plant. The glow is the result of his weekly medical treatments so intensive that they cause his body to emit visible light. They keep him alive for exactly 7 more days. Without them, he dies. The margin for error in his survival is 0. Miss one treatment and Burns collapses within a week. What the show does not make fully explicit but allows you to assemble from the available information is what those treatments are actually doing. Burns's body is not surviving through normal biological processes. It has not survived through normal biological processes for a very long time. The treatments are not restoring him to health. They are maintaining him in a state of managed illness, a specific biological equilibrium in which every disease he carries and every damage his body has sustained is being held in a kind of permanent stasis that prevents any single condition from progressing to the point of killing him. The Three Stooges syndrome that his doctor describes, in which all of his diseases are present simultaneously but none can progress because they are all blocking each other, is not a natural phenomenon. It is the result of weekly radiation treatments that keep every biological process in his body at exactly the level of activity that his continued survival requires. Burns is not immortal. He is too expensive to die. He has spent more than a century building an infrastructure of resources, medical relationships, financial power, and institutional control specifically designed to ensure that his death, when it would otherwise occur naturally, is prevented by the application of sufficient money and technology. He is the logical endpoint of the question of what happens when wealth is applied without limit to the problem of human mortality. The answer is not that you live forever. The answer is that you live considerably longer than any biological process would allow, maintained by the mechanical application of treatments that your body cannot survive without, dependent on the continued functioning of an infrastructure that must never be allowed to fail. Smithers understands this more completely than anyone else in Springfield. His devotion to Burns is not simply the devotion of a loyal employee or even of a person who loves his employer in whatever complex way Smithers loves Burns. His devotion is the devotion of someone who understands that he is the single most important component of the infrastructure that keeps Burns alive. If Smithers misses the weekly treatment appointment, Burns dies. The devotion is real, and the devotion is also a specific and irreplaceable form of medical necessity. Smithers is not just Burns's assistant. He is Burns's life support system, and he knows it. On the Production Pipeline Extended, the 6-month production timeline for a single Simpsons episode, from first pitch to broadcast, means that at any given moment the production team is simultaneously living in at least 5 or 6 different creative time zones. There are episodes being pitched today that will not air for half a year. There are episodes in the animation stage that were written 4 months ago. There are episodes in the recording stage that were written 2 months ago. There are episodes in post-production that were recorded last month. And there are episodes that have already aired that the writing room has effectively forgotten the specifics of because the pipeline has moved so far forward since they were produced. This temporal fragmentation of the creative process has specific effects on the show that are visible in the work if you know what to look for. Callbacks to recent episodes are sometimes awkward because the episode being referenced was produced in a different creative period from the episode making the reference, written by different people working in a different room with a different culture. Self-referential jokes that depend on a specific awareness of what the show recently did sometimes miss their target slightly because the reference is to something produced 6 months ago in a different creative context. The show is always in conversation with versions of itself that exist at multiple stages of completion simultaneously, and managing that conversation coherently across a large and rotating writing staff is one of the production's most persistent and least discussed challenges. The animation pipeline adds another layer of temporal complexity. By the time a script reaches the animation stage, the writers who produced it have already moved on to stories that are months further along in development. The directors and animators working from the script are interpreting material that the writers cannot easily revisit or clarify, because the writers are in a different part of the pipeline working on different episodes. Questions about creative intent that come up in the animation process are answered by the showrunner's office rather than by the original writers, because the original writers are not available in the same way. The show's creative process is distributed across time in ways that most creative processes are not. On the show's relationship to American life extended, The Simpsons has been on the air for longer than the gap between the end of World War II and the show's own premiere. It has been running for as long as the entirety of the Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon presidencies combined. It has been continuous through economic booms and recessions, through technological revolutions, through the rise and transformation of multiple communication platforms, through cultural shifts that have changed how Americans understand their own identity and their relationship to the institutions around them. What the show has done across all of that time, with a consistency that is its most remarkable achievement, is remain recognizable as a portrait of a specific kind of American life. The circumstances of the Simpson family, the specific combination of modest income and aspirational desire, of institutional failures and personal resilience, of genuine love contained within obvious dysfunction, have remained legible as an American story across 36 years of enormous change in the real world. The show has adapted its surfaces, its topical references, its specific cultural touchstones, to remain in conversation with the present moment in each of its seasons. But the underlying story, the story of a family trying to hold together in a world that makes holding together difficult, has not changed. This is partly because the show's creators understood from the beginning that the most durable stories are not about specific moments, but about persistent conditions. Homer's economic anxiety is not about the specific economic crises that occurred during the show's run, though the show has engaged with those crises when they were current. It is about the persistent condition of working-class economic precarity in American life, a condition that was present before the show began and will be present after it ends. Marge's navigating of institutional inadequacy, of schools that do not have adequate resources, and hospitals that are not fully accessible, and community structures that do not fully support the people who depend on them, is not about specific failures that the show documented. It is about persistent structural inadequacies that have characterized American middle-class life for longer than the show has been running. The predictions phenomenon, which has been discussed extensively in popular culture, is most accurately understood as a consequence of this approach. The show did not predict the future. It described persistent conditions and logical trajectories in American life clearly enough that, when specific events manifested those conditions and trajectories, the show's prior descriptions matched what happened. A writer's room staffed with highly educated observers of American culture who understood the underlying dynamics of the society they were depicting could extrapolate those dynamics toward their logical consequences with enough accuracy that the consequences, when they arrived, resembled the extrapolations. That is not prophecy, it is analysis. It is the specific form of intelligence that the show assembled in its writing room and directed at the world it was depicting, and the quality of the analysis is visible in how often the world subsequently arrived at the conclusions the analysis had anticipated. On the final season and what ending means, the question of how The Simpsons should end has been asked and answered provisionally many times over the past 2 decades. The show has received renewal after renewal with no announced conclusion. Groening and Gene and Fox have all been asked the question and have all deflected it with varying degrees of specificity. The show continues. The question remains open. What makes the question genuinely interesting rather than simply procedural is that The Simpsons has, over the course of its run, made the question of its own ending a thematic preoccupation. The show has imagined its characters aging in future episodes and then retreated from those futures. It has depicted the family's circumstances changing in ways that would alter the show fundamentally and then reset those changes before the next episode begins. It has repeatedly gestured toward conclusions and then declined to commit to them. This pattern is not simply commercial caution on the part of the production. It reflects something genuine about what the show is and what it means to its audience. The Simpsons provides the specific comfort of things that do not change in a world that changes constantly. The house at 742 Evergreen Terrace looks the same as it looked in 1989. Homer still goes to work at the nuclear plant. Bart is still in the 4th grade. Lisa still plays her saxophone. Marge still makes dinner. The couch gag still plays. The credits still roll. Whatever happened in the world this week, The Simpsons exists and it is the same as it was. To end the show would be to withdraw this specific form of comfort from the audience that has been receiving it for 36 years. It would be to acknowledge that the permanent present of Springfield is not actually permanent, that the family that never ages is going to age now, that the town that always resets is about to have a final state from which it will not reset. The ending would be an admission that time passes and things end, an admission that is in direct contradiction with everything the show has built itself on for 3.5 decades. This is probably why the ending has not come and shows no immediate sign of coming. Not because the show cannot imagine an ending, it has imagined many, but because delivering one would require the show to betray its own deepest promise to its audience. And so it continues. And the characters remain the ages they have always been. And Homer comes home from work at 5:30, and the family sits on the couch and the credits roll. And we keep watching. Because we know that as long as we do, Springfield will be there. And Springfield being there means the world has not entirely changed while we were looking away. On what the show finally is. 36 years is a long time to be one thing. Most things that persist for 36 years have become several things in the process, have transformed across their own history in ways that make what they are now different from what they were. The Simpsons has transformed. Its animation has changed. Its writing staff has turned over multiple times. Its cultural context has changed around it. Its relationship to the audience has evolved as the audience has changed, as people who were children when the show began have grown into adults who watch it differently, with different context and different emotional histories with the material. But underneath all of those changes, the show has remained committed to a single story. A family, a house, a town. A set of people who love each other in the complicated, frustrated, generative, occasionally spectacular way that people who live together and know each other completely love each other. The satire is real. The darkness is real. The environmental contamination and the institutional corruption and the economic precarity and the cognitive damage and all of the other things that the show's most devoted analysis has identified in its fabric are all genuinely present in the work, but they are present as the context for a love story. The love story is what the show has always been about. Homer loves Marge. This is the foundational fact of the show's universe. It is more fundamental than the nuclear plant, or the yellow skin, or the floating timeline. Homer loves Marge with a completeness that his cognitive limitations make more rather than less touching, because he loves her with everything he has, and what he has is not very much. He loves his children with the anxious, clumsy, earnest love of a man who is not entirely sure how to be a father but who is completely certain that he wants to be one. He stumbles. He fails. He does things that should have consequences that do not come because the show is a cartoon and consequences are negotiable in Springfield. But he always comes home. That is the thing. No matter what Homer does, no matter how far the episode takes him from Evergreen Terrace, no matter how catastrophically things go wrong in the story, by the end of 22 minutes he is home, on the couch, with his family around him. The credits roll, and next week it happens again. The show has been making this same argument, week after week, season after season, for 36 years. Coming home matters. Being with the people you love matters. The house that is always the right size for the story being told in it matters. The family that should not work and does matters. That is what the 177 facts have been building toward. Not a mystery, not a theory, not a cultural analysis. Just the simple and stubborn fact that after everything, after all of the dark readings, and the radiation theories, and the coma dreams, and the conspiracy about Burns, and the geography that makes no sense, and the timeline that refuses to hold still, what the show is actually about is a family that keeps choosing each other. Every episode, every season, 36 years in a row. And we keep watching. Because that choice, made over and over in a world that makes it difficult to make, is one of the few things on television that feels consistently and reliably true. Number. Final deep dives. The last things worth saying about Springfield? On Homer Simpson as an American character extended, Homer Simpson is the most watched fictional character in the history of American television. No single character has appeared in more episodes over a longer period of time in the primetime broadcast space. This is a factual record, not a critical judgment. But the record is interesting because of what it tells you about which version of an American character the country has been willing to keep watching for 36 years. The character America has chosen to keep spending time with is not a hero in any conventional sense. He is not particularly competent. He is not morally admirable. He is not aspirational in the way that most American popular culture expects its central characters to be aspirational. He is not working his way towards something better. He is not overcoming his limitations through discipline and effort. He is Homer. He falls down and gets up. He does it again. He goes home. What Homer offers that no aspirational character can offer is the specific comfort of being seen accurately. Most American popular culture, across most of its history, has offered audiences a version of themselves that is better than they are. Characters who succeed in the ways audiences wish they could succeed. Characters who make the right choices under pressure, who find the right words at the right moments, who overcome their worst impulses and are rewarded for overcoming them. This is a noble tradition, and it has produced some of the most important art in American culture. But it does not produce Homer. Homer fails. Consistently, specifically, in ways that are recognizable to anyone who has ever meant to do better and not managed it. He sleeps when he should be working. He eats when he should be thinking. He avoids difficult conversations until they become catastrophes. He prioritizes immediate pleasure over long-term welfare with a reliability that the show has never apologized for. He is a portrait of human weakness as it actually exists in ordinary people, rather than as it appears in stories that want their protagonists to transcend their weakness. The show does not endorse Homer's failures. It does not suggest that his approach to life is admirable or that the audience should emulate it. It simply shows him as he is, clearly and without softening, and then shows the family that loves him anyway. The family that sees him completely and has decided, episode after episode, season after season, year after year, that what he is enough. That is what makes Homer moving rather than simply funny. The love he receives is more credible because it is given to someone who has not earned it in the conventional ways. It is given freely by people who know exactly who they are giving it to. On Lisa Simpson as an American character extended, Lisa Simpson is the show's most uncomfortable character, and that discomfort is precisely the point. She is 8 years old and she is the most morally serious person in Springfield. She is brilliant and earnest and principled, and she is consistently failed by every institution she encounters, failed by her family which cannot meet her at her intellectual level, failed by her school which does not have the resources to adequately educate her, failed by her community which treats her seriousness as a social deficiency, failed by a culture that does not have a good place for an 8-year-old girl who is smarter than most of the adults around her. The show does not resolve Lisa's situation. It does not provide her with a community that finally appreciates her, or a school that finally meets her needs, or a family that finally rises to her level. She remains, episode after episode and season after season, in the same position she was in when the show began. Brilliant and isolated and determined and not quite at home anywhere. The flash-forward episodes that have depicted Lisa as an adult show that this condition does not improve dramatically as she ages. She becomes a more competent version of the same person, with more tools for navigating a world that is still not quite built for her. She finds people who understand her partially, relationships that approximate what she needs without fully providing it, causes that give her investment without fully satisfying it. This is a more honest portrait of what it means to be a certain kind of intelligent person in a world that was not designed with them in mind than most television is willing to offer. Most stories about smart children resolve in one of two ways. The child finds their people and the isolation ends, or the child's intelligence is revealed to have been a burden that wisdom teaches them to release. Lisa's story resolves in neither direction. She stays who she is, in the place she is, and navigates it as well as she can, which is better than most people could, but not as well as she deserves. That is the true condition of being genuinely and uncomfortably intelligent in a world that prefers comfortable mediocrity, and the show has been willing to portray it without softening it for 36 years. Her saxophone is the crucial detail. It is the thing that is purely hers, the thing that is not explained or contained by any of the structures around her, the thing that the show returns to consistently as the image of Lisa fully herself. When she plays the saxophone, she is not performing for anyone. She is not demonstrating her intelligence, or arguing a position, or navigating an institution. She is just being entirely what she is, unmodified by the demands of the world around her. The saxophone scenes are the show's most direct expressions of what Lisa means. That there is something in this child that the world is not fully equipped to contain, and that thing is worth protecting. On the show's relationship to time extended, the most extraordinary thing about The Simpsons is not any specific episode, or any specific joke, or any specific character. The most extraordinary thing is that it has kept going. That after 36 years and nearly 800 episodes, there are still people making it and still people watching it, and that the act of watching it after all of this time retains something of what watching it felt like in 1989 or 1995 or 2003. This is not the case for most things that last a long time. Most things that persist across decades become unrecognizable to the people who knew them at the beginning. They change so completely that what they are now has only a historical relationship to what they were. The Simpsons has changed. Anyone who claims otherwise has not paid close attention. The show of the current era is not the same show as the show of seasons 3 through 8, but it retains enough of the essential thing, enough of the voice and the character and the specific emotional register that defines it at its best, to still be recognizable as itself. Part of this is the cast. The same people who were in the recording booth in 1989 are in the recording booth now, older, their voices carrying the specific weight of what 36 years does to a human being, but still doing the same thing they were doing then. When Castellaneta says dough in 2025, it is the same dough he was saying in 1990. It has 36 years more history behind it, but it is the same sound, made by the same person, in the same way. The character has not aged, the person has. The collision of those two facts, of an unchanging character and a changing performer, is one of the stranger and more moving things about the show's longevity. Part of it is the house. 742 Evergreen Terrace is still there. It still looks the way it looked when the show began, or close enough to it that the differences are refinements rather than transformations. You can come back to that house after years away and find it recognizable. That recognizability is a form of fidelity, a commitment to providing something that stays the same while everything else changes. In a culture that values constant novelty and constant change, the Springfield house that looks the same as it always has is quietly radical. And part of it is Homer coming home. Every episode, regardless of what happened in it, ends with Homer home. The family intact, the house standing, the pattern holding. This is the show's deepest and most consistent formal commitment. Whatever happens in the story, however far it goes, the family comes back together by the end. The reset that critics sometimes describe as a flaw, as lazy writing, as a failure of narrative consequence, is actually the show's central promise. We will not take this from you. Whatever else happens, the family stays together. The house stays standing. Homer comes home. That promise, made and kept across 36 years and nearly 800 episodes, is the most remarkable thing the show has done. Not any single achievement in writing or performance or animation or cultural impact. The sustained commitment, season after season, to delivering the same emotional truth in a new story each week. To saying, again, that this matters, that this family matters, that coming home matters, that the specific and ordinary love of specific and ordinary people is the thing worth returning to every Sunday. For as long as there is an audience willing to come back, we came back. For 36 years, we kept coming back. And Springfield kept being there when we did. That is the whole show, really. Everything else is detail. On the recording booth and what happens there extended, the specific alchemy of The Simpsons recording sessions is one of the least documented and most consequential aspects of the show's production. What happens in that room, when the full cast is present and the scripts are being performed for the first time in real time with other people listening, is genuinely difficult to reproduce by description. The people who have been in that room describe it in terms that suggest something more than a professional recording session. They describe it as a place where something collaborative is happening, where the accumulated weight of decades of shared work between the same people produces a quality of ensemble performance that has no technical equivalent. Dan Castellaneta has spent more hours in that room voicing Homer Simpson than Homer Simpson has spent at the Springfield nuclear power plant across all of the show's episodes combined. 36 years of periodic recording sessions, typically several times per season, adds up to an extraordinary amount of time spent inhabiting the same character in the same professional context, with the same professional partners. The relationship between Castellaneta and the character, and between Castellaneta and his castmates, has been shaped by that accumulation of shared time in ways that are not visible in any single episode, but that are audible in the quality of the performances across the show's entire run. Julie Kavner has said in one of her rare interviews that when she voices Marge, she is not performing Marge. She is being Marge, in the sense that the character has become sufficiently embedded in her that the distinction between performing and being has blurred to the point of being meaningless. This is what happens when you do the same thing with sufficient consistency and commitment over sufficient time. The character stops being a costume you put on and becomes a layer of identity you carry. Marge is part of Kavner's voice now in a way that she was not in 1989. The years are in the performance. Nancy Cartwright has described a similar experience with Bart, and has noted the specific strangeness of a situation in which she is physically aging while the character she voices is frozen at the age of 10. She brings to each recording session everything that has happened to her since the previous one, every year of accumulated experience and loss and learning, and produces from all of that the voice of a child who has not changed since the show began. The asymmetry between the person in the booth and the character on the page is one of the stranger facts of voice acting on a very long-running animated series, and The Simpsons cast has been living with it longer than anyone else in the history of the medium. On Springfield Elementary and American Education Extended, Springfield Elementary School, where Bart and Lisa have been enrolled for 36 years without advancing past the 4th and 2nd grades respectively, is one of the show's most precisely observed institutional satires. The school is underfunded, understaffed, and administered by a man who turns out not to be who he says he is. Its food is inadequate. Its physical plant is deteriorating. Its educational resources were further depleted when Burns stole the oil found beneath it. Its principal has a complex relationship with his mother that the show has developed into one of its most specific running character observations. But the school is also, within the show's world, a place where genuine education occasionally happens. Teachers who care appear in specific episodes. Connections between students and instructors that change the course of a child's development are depicted with genuine feeling. The show does not portray Springfield Elementary as simply a failed institution. It portrays it as an institution that has the capacity to do what it is supposed to do, and that is consistently prevented from doing it by the specific combination of inadequate funding, bureaucratic inertia, and administrative failure that characterizes public education in the America the show is depicting. Lisa's relationship to Springfield Elementary is the show's most nuanced engagement with the institution. She is a student whose gifts the school cannot adequately serve. The resources required to provide her with an education commensurate with her abilities simply do not exist at Springfield Elementary. But she stays. She participates. She advocates for herself and for her fellow students with the energy and commitment of someone who believes that institutions can be made to do better even when they are currently doing worse. Her relationship to the school is one of the show's most direct engagements, with the question of how an intelligent and principled person maintains their engagement with broken institutions rather than simply withdrawing from them. On Moe's Tavern and What It Means Extended, Moe's Tavern is the other home in the show. Not the primary home, which is 742 Evergreen Terrace, but the secondary home, the place where Homer goes when the primary home becomes too complicated or too demanding, or simply when he wants to be in a place where the complications of domestic life are held at a specific kind of bay. The tavern is not a good place by any objective measure. Moe is not a reliable bartender, a trustworthy friend, or a mentally stable individual by the standards of the show's own universe. The clientele is limited. The decor is uninviting. The beer is of uncertain quality. But the tavern has a specific quality that the show has returned to consistently across 36 years. It is a place where Homer is known. Moe knows who Homer is. Barney knows who Homer is. The regulars at the bar know Homer's name and his habits, and his particular version of the human condition, and they accept all of it without requiring it to be different. The tavern is the place where the social contract is extremely simple. You come, you drink, you stay as long as you want, and nobody asks you to be more than you are. For a character whose fundamental emotional insecurity is about whether he is lovable as he actually is rather than as he might theoretically become, the tavern provides something genuinely necessary. Moe's character, which has developed considerably across the show's run from a simple barkeep into a figure of specific and somewhat tragic complexity, is interesting partly because of the loneliness underneath the gruffness. Moe is, in his specific way, another portrait of what the show does with characters who are alone in their particular manner of being. He has failed at love more than once in specific and documented ways. He has had moments of genuine connection that did not last. He tends a bar that is not very good, serves customers who are not there because the bar is good but because they have nowhere else to go, and he does this with a dedication that suggests he has found his purpose here, even if his purpose is not an enviable one. On the show's legacy across American comedy extended, the influence of The Simpsons on American comedy writing is so pervasive that it is almost impossible to separate the show from the comedy culture it helped create. Writers who grew up watching the show in the 90s, who were formed by its specific combination of intellectual density and emotional directness and structural ambition, are now running the shows that define the current moment in American comedy. The Simpsons' DNA is in the DNA of contemporary American comedy in ways that go beyond direct stylistic influence and extend to foundational assumptions about what comedy is capable of and what it is for. The show demonstrated, at a moment when television comedy was operating under specific and limiting assumptions about its own capacities, that a weekly animated comedy could sustain genuine intellectual ambition without losing its popular appeal. That it could be dense with ideas and still be funny. That it could take its characters seriously as people and still generate comedy from their circumstances. That it could be satirically accurate about American life without being preachy or didactic. These are not insights that seem particularly revolutionary today, because the show's success in acting on them made them obvious. But they were not obvious in 1989. The show made them obvious by demonstrating them every week for years. The Harvard-trained writers who defined the show's classic era went on to train a generation of comedy writers who absorbed their standards and their approaches and applied them in new contexts. The specific culture of The Simpsons' writing room, its combination of intellectual rigor and emotional availability and relentless self-criticism, spread through the industry as the people who had been shaped by it moved into leadership positions in other productions. The show colonized American comedy not just through its cultural influence on audiences, but through its practical influence on the people who learned to make comedy inside it and then carried what they had learned into the wider world. On the final fact extended, the 177th fact about The Simpsons is not a production detail or a historical record or a creative secret. It is the simplest and most verifiable fact available. The show is still on. After 36 years, after all of the critical cycles and the commercial negotiations and the creative arguments and the cast changes and the technology transitions and the cultural transformations that have reshaped everything around it, The Simpsons is still being made and still being watched. This is remarkable. Most things do not last 36 years in any recognizable form. Relationships do not always last 36 years. Careers do not always last 36 years. The human body changes so completely across 36 years that the person who begins the period and the person who ends it share a physical structure, but not the same physical substance. Every cell replaced, every system rebuilt. 36 years is most of a lifetime for most purposes. The Simpsons has been running for most of a lifetime, and it will continue until it stops, which it will eventually, because everything stops eventually. It will continue. Homer will go to work at the plant, Marge will hold the household together, Bart will do something inadvisable, Lisa will notice something important and be unable to make anyone care about it. Maggie will watch everything from behind her pacifier with eyes that understand more than anyone in the room suspects. The couch gag will play. The credits will roll. and the next episode will begin. That is the 177th fact, and the most important one. Springfield is still there, and as long as we keep coming back to it, it always will be. There is a specific quality that The Simpsons has that most long-running things do not. It has the quality of being genuinely loved by the people who make it. Not always in every season, and not always by every person who has worked on it at any given moment, but with a consistency across its history that you can feel in the best episodes, and that seems to persist even in the episodes that fall short of the best. The people who have made this show across the decades and across the many different iterations of the production team have generally been people who believed in what they were doing, who thought it mattered, who thought that the specific combination of comedy and feeling and social observation and character love that the show attempted was worth attempting well. This belief has produced different results in different eras. The belief in what the show was doing was most perfectly expressed in its peak years, when the writing room was functioning at the highest level it has ever reached, and the cast was fully settled into their characters, and the production had developed the specific fluency that comes from years of doing the same work together. But the belief has also been present in later years, in episodes that do not match the peak, but that carry the marks of people who are trying seriously to do something worthwhile with the material they have inherited. The audience has felt this. The sustained size of the audience across 36 years, the persistent renewal of attention to a show that, by any conventional measure, should have exhausted its audience's goodwill decades ago, reflects the audience's perception that the show is still being made with genuine investment. That the people making it still care whether it is good, that there is still something at stake for them in the work. This is not a small thing, coursist. Most things that last this long coast, they develop the momentum of their own institutional continuity, and they ride that momentum without the specific energy of genuine creative investment. The Simpsons has periods of coasting. It has periods where the institutional momentum is carrying it more than the creative energy is, but it has never become entirely a coast, has never completely lost the quality of being made by people who are genuinely trying. Whether the best episodes of the future will match the best episodes of the past is a question that cannot be answered from here. The creative potential of the show, given the specific instruments available to it and the specific world it is depicting and the specific audience it has developed across its history, is real. Whether that potential is fully realized in any given season is a function of who is in the room, what they are thinking about, what the cultural moment is providing them as material, and whether the specific combination of those factors produces the conditions for work of genuine quality. What we can say, from the position of 36 years of evidence, is that the show has produced work of genuine quality before and has done so repeatedly across different eras and under different conditions. The capacity for it is built into the show's structure. Whether any specific season activates that capacity fully is not something that can be predicted or guaranteed. It is just the ongoing proposition that the show makes to its audience. We are still here, we are still trying, come back next week and see what we have. We come back. We have been coming back for 36 years. Whatever the show is in any given moment, it is the thing we come back to. It is Springfield. It is the house that is always the right size. It is the family that stays together. It is Homer coming home. And it is enough. It has always been enough. It will be enough for as long as it lasts. Here is the thing about watching The Simpsons for a very long time. At some point you stop watching it and start inhabiting it. The show stops being something you observe and becomes something you carry. The specific sounds of the characters, the specific visual grammar of Springfield, the specific rhythm of a Simpsons joke, these things become part of your internal landscape in a way that very little else from any medium manages to achieve across the breadth of an audience. Ask someone who grew up watching the show to describe a specific episode, and they will often not be able to tell you what season it was in or what year it aired. But they will be able to tell you how the episode made them feel. They will be able to tell you which couch they were sitting on when they first watched it. They will be able to tell you whether a parent was in the room or whether they watched it alone. The show has embedded itself in memories that are not about the show at all. It has become the container for moments in people's lives that had nothing specifically to do with Springfield. This is the deepest measure of a piece of culture's impact, not the critical reception or the ratings or the awards. The measure is whether it became part of people's inner lives, whether it showed up in the architecture of how they understood the world, whether it became one of the languages they used to talk to each other, One of the shared references that allowed people who might not have had much else in common to recognize each other as people who had lived through something together. The Simpsons did this. For 36 years, week after week, the show gave people something to share. A joke that everyone in the room had heard. An episode that two strangers could discover they both loved. A character whose specific way of being in the world resonated with enough people across enough different kinds of lives to become a kind of universal. Homer's specific failure mode. Lisa's specific isolation. Marge's specific patience. Bart's specific energy. These are not just fictional character traits. They are ways of being human that the show named and depicted clearly enough that people could recognize them in themselves and in each other. That is the final legacy of the show. After all the records and all the awards and all the cultural analysis, it gave people a language for things that were hard to put into words. It named the feeling of meaning well and doing badly. It named the feeling of being too smart for your situation. It named the feeling of holding everything together while nobody notices. It named the feeling of wanting to cause trouble just to see what happens. It named all of these feelings clearly enough that people who had them could point to the show and say, there, that is what I mean. And in doing that, it did the only thing that art is actually for. It made people feel less alone with the specific and personal fact of being who they are. In a town that doesn't exist, in a family that can't age, in a world that resets itself every 22 minutes, the show told the truth about what it feels like to be a person. It did that for 36 years. It is still doing it. And whatever you think about the show's later seasons or its commercial arrangements or its place in television history, that is the thing that matters. Springfield is waiting. It is always waiting, and it is always exactly as you left it. Good night.